Hello everyone. Tonight I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now close your eyes and let's begin. The Devil's Highway, from Marcus Thompson. The stretch of Interstate 15 between Barstow and Las Vegas has always been a strange place during the deep hours of night, when the desert wind carries sounds that don't belong to any earthly source, and the darkness beyond your headlights seems to pulse with its own malevolent rhythm. I've been driving this route for 12 years now, hauling everything from electronics to groceries in my Peterbilt 389, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weird the desert had to offer. The mirages that dance on summer asphalt, the way radio stations fade in and out with voices speaking languages that don't exist, the occasional lights that follow your rig for miles before vanishing without explanation. But nothing had prepared me for what happened during that October run, when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and my CB radio started picking up frequencies from somewhere far below the highway. It began as just another late-night haul, the kind that pays double overtime but leaves you questioning your life choices as you fight to keep your eyes open past 3 in the morning. I'd loaded up in Riverside with a full trailer of furniture bound for a warehouse in Henderson, and the dispatcher had emphasized the importance of making the delivery window. The traffic through Los Angeles had been lighter than usual, probably because of the strange weather reports, warning of sudden temperature drops, and unexplained seismic activity throughout the Mojave. Most drivers had chosen to wait until morning, but I needed the money, and my Peterbilt had never let me down in 12 years of hard driving. The first sign that something was different came around mile marker 127, where the highway cuts through a particularly desolate stretch of desert, punctuated only by the occasional Joshua tree and the rusted remains of abandoned gas stations from decades past. I'd noticed that my engine was running quieter than usual, that deep, throaty rumble of the Caterpillar C-15 reduced to an almost whispered purr that seemed muffled by the night air itself. The temperature gauge was reading normal and all my other instruments looked fine, but there was something unsettling about the way the sound seemed to be absorbed by the darkness beyond my high beams. That's when I started hearing the other noise, a low vibration that seemed to come from beneath the asphalt itself, rising up through the steel frame of my truck and into my bones. At first, I thought it might be another rig running parallel on a service road, but when I checked my mirrors, the highway stretched empty behind me for miles, my trailer lights the only points of illumination in an ocean of black. The sound wasn't mechanical. Not the familiar rhythm of diesel engines or the whine of transmission gears. It was organic somehow, like breathing, but breathing from something impossibly large, hidden somewhere beneath the desert floor. I reached for my CB radio to check if any other drivers were experiencing similar phenomena, but instead of the usual chatter or static, I heard something that made my hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. It was a voice, deep and resonant, speaking in a language that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to some primitive part of my brain that remembered when humans huddled around fires and feared the darkness beyond the light. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakably commanding, as if something ancient and powerful was issuing orders to unseen listeners scattered throughout the desert. As I continued down the highway, trying to convince myself that I was experiencing nothing more than exhaustion-induced hallucinations, the temperature inside my cab began to drop, despite the heater running at full blast. My breath started forming small clouds in the air, and frost began to creep across the edges of my windshield in patterns that looked disturbingly deliberate, like symbols or runes from a forgotten alphabet. The highway ahead remained perfectly normal in appearance, the yellow lines clearly visible in my headlights. But the desert on both sides seemed to be moving, undulating like a vast black sea disturbed by something swimming beneath its surface. The CB voices grew louder and more numerous, overlapping in a cacophony that suggested dozens of speakers all broadcasting simultaneously from different locations. Some voices were clearly human, truck drivers reporting strange phenomena along various highways throughout the Southwest, but others were distinctly not human, producing sounds that ranged from guttural growling to high-pitched keening that made my teeth ache. Through the chaos, I began to pick out recurring phrases in English, references to the awakening below and the horns of the deep ones, that sent chills down my spine despite my attempts to remain rational. Around mile marker 134, my headlights illuminated something impossible on the road ahead. The asphalt was cracking in a perfectly straight line across both lanes, and from the widening fissure, a pale yellow light was beginning to emerge, pulsing in rhythm with the breathing sound that continued to vibrate through my truck's frame. I pressed harder on the accelerator, knowing that stopping would be the worst possible choice, but dreading what I might see as I passed over whatever was causing the highway to split open. As I approached the crack, the light grew brighter, and I could see that it wasn't electric or chemical, but something organic, like bioluminescence from some deep-sea creature that had never been meant to surface. The edges of the fissure were lined with what looked like bone-white ridges, curved and pointed like massive teeth or claws, and between them, something was definitely moving. Something large enough that I could only see fragments of its form through the opening in the road. The moment my front wheels crossed the crack, every electronic device in my cab went haywire. The CB radio shrieked with feedback, my GPS display flickered between normal operation and showing impossible locations hundreds of miles underground, and my engine computer began throwing error codes for systems that don't exist on any truck manufactured by human hands. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees in seconds, and ice began forming on the inside of my windows, despite the impossibility of such rapid atmospheric change. But worse than the mechanical failures was the realization that something was responding to my presence, that the breathing sound from below had changed its rhythm and intensity, as if whatever was down there had become aware of me passing overhead. Through the cacophony of the CB radio, I heard a voice that sounded almost human calling my name, my full name, pronouncing it with an accent that suggested it originated from somewhere very far from the Mojave Desert. The voice was accompanied by others, all calling names, dozens of names, as if they were summoning every driver who had ever passed this stretch of highway during the dark hours. I pushed my Peterbilt to its maximum safe speed, watching in my mirrors as the crack in the highway behind me continued to widen, releasing more of that sickly yellow light into the night sky. The light began to coalesce into shapes, tall angular forms that might have been structures or might have been living things, rising from whatever space existed beneath the desert. They cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, reaching across the sand toward my receding trailer lights, like grasping fingers. The radio voices reached a crescendo as I put distance between myself and the impossible fissure, but now they seemed to be coordinating, organizing themselves into some kind of chant or summoning ritual. The non-human voices took on a more prominent role, and I realized with growing horror that they were providing harmonic support for an incantation being spoken by the human voices. Truckers whose names I recognized from years of CB chatter. Drivers who had presumably vanished along this very stretch of highway. By the time I reached the Nevada state line, the phenomena had begun to subside, but they didn't disappear entirely. The temperature in my cab slowly returned to normal, the ice melted from my windows, and my electronic systems resumed proper operation. But the CB radio continued to pick up faint transmissions from below, whispered conversations between voices that discussed surface conditions and traffic patterns, with the casual familiarity of shift workers comparing notes. I made my delivery in Henderson without incident, unloaded the furniture into a perfectly normal warehouse staffed by perfectly ordinary people who showed no awareness that anything unusual had occurred during the night. But when I checked my logbook later that morning, I discovered that according to my electronic records, the trip from Riverside had taken 40 minutes longer than the clock time indicated. as if those miles over the cracked highway had existed in a different temporal space altogether. The return trip 3 days later was uneventful, the highway showing no signs of the massive fissure I'd driven over, but I'd made a point of avoiding that route during the late-night hours ever since. Other drivers have started reporting similar experiences along different stretches of desert highway, always between midnight and dawn, always involving voices from below and temperatures that drop without meteorological explanation. The CB chatter suggests that whatever is down there is expanding its area of influence, that more sections of highway are beginning to crack and glow with that organic yellow light. I still drive the night shifts because the money's better and the roads are clear, but now I keep my CB turned to emergency channels only, and I've installed additional temperature sensors throughout my cab to provide early warning of atmospheric anomalies. Sometimes, during the quietest hours when traffic is minimal and the desert stretches empty in all directions, I can still hear faint traces of that breathing sound rising through my truck. The language of light. From Marcus Chin. The thing about driving long haul is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you start to notice patterns in everything. The way certain stretches of highway feel different at 3 in the morning versus 3 in the afternoon. How some truck stops always smell like burnt coffee and diesel no matter what time of year you visit. The rhythm of your own breathing matching the steady thrum of the engine beneath you. But what I noticed that October night on Interstate 40 somewhere between the Oklahoma border and Little Rock was something I'd never seen before in all my years of watching taillights disappear into the darkness ahead of me. The rain had been falling steadily since Amarillo, that kind of persistent drizzle that makes the asphalt gleam like black glass under the sodium lights. My Peterbilt's wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, and the CB radio crackled occasionally with tired voices of other drivers pushing through the night. I was hauling a load of furniture bound for Memphis, nothing unusual, nothing that should have drawn any particular attention to my rig as it rolled through the Arkansas countryside. That's when I first spotted the other truck in my mirrors. It was maybe a quarter-mile back, its headlights cutting through the rain like twin searchlights. Nothing odd about that either, except for the way it seemed to maintain that exact distance no matter how my speed varied with the rolling hills. When I slowed for a curve, it slowed. When I picked up speed on a straightaway, somehow it matched my pace perfectly, staying in that same position, like it was tethered to my trailer by an invisible rope. The first time I saw the blinker spell something, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Sleep deprivation does strange things to a driver's mind. Makes you see movement in your peripheral vision where there's nothing but empty road, or hear voices in the white noise of tires on wet pavement. But as I watched in my side mirror, the truck behind me began signaling. Left blinker 3 flashes, right blinker 1 flash. Left again, 2 flashes. The pattern continued for nearly a minute before stopping entirely. I rubbed my eyes and checked the clock on my dashboard. 2:47 in the morning. I'd been driving for 11 hours with only brief stops for fuel and food, so maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. Maybe the other driver was just having electrical problems, or maybe he was trying to signal something to another trucker I couldn't see. The CB was quiet except for static, and when I tried to raise anyone on Channel 19, nobody responded. But then it happened again. This time I paid closer attention, counting the flashes and trying to make sense of the sequence. Left, right, left, right, left, right, 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 left, right, left. If I was counting correctly, and if each sequence represented a letter in some kind of code, then what I was seeing might actually spell something. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning humming through my sleeper cab. I reached for the CB handset and tried again. Breaker 19, this is the Peterbilt eastbound at about mile marker 135. Got somebody behind me with some interesting light patterns. You copy? Nothing but the soft hiss of static answered me back. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, with only the occasional pair of headlights coming the other way to break up the monotony of rain and darkness. When the blinkers started up again, I grabbed a pen from my logbook and started writing down what I saw. 3 left, 1 right, 2 left, 1 right, then a pause longer than the others. 3 right, 2 left, 1 right, 2 left, another pause. The sequences continued for several minutes, and as I scribbled numbers on the back of a fuel receipt, a pattern began to emerge that made my hands tremble slightly on the steering wheel. If I was interpreting this correctly, if 3 flashes meant the 3rd letter of the alphabet and 2 flashes meant the 2nd, then what I was seeing spelled out words, real words, and the first word I managed to decode was hello. My mouth went dry despite the humid air seeping in around the door seals. I checked my mirrors again, and the truck was still there, maintaining that same precise distance. Its headlights were generic, the kind you'd see on any number of makes and models, and in the rain and darkness I couldn't make out any details about the cab or trailer. But those blinkers continued their measured cadence, and as I kept writing, more words became clear. "Hello, Marcus," the lights had said. Then, after a longer pause, "Beautiful night." The fact that whoever was behind me knew my name should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, I felt a strange sense of curiosity overtaking my fear. Truck drivers are a tight-knit community in some ways. We share information about road conditions, speed traps, good places to eat. Maybe this was just another driver who'd heard my name on the CB at some point, though I couldn't remember giving it out recently. Still, there was something unsettling about this whole situation that made me want to put some distance between myself and my mysterious follower. I pressed down on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb past 75. The rain was lighter now, just a fine mist that caught the light from my running lights and created halos of amber and red in the darkness. But when I checked my mirrors, the other truck had somehow kept pace with me, still maintaining that same exact distance, as if my increased speed meant nothing at all. The blinkers started again, and this time the message was longer, more complex. I found myself divided between watching the road ahead and trying to decode what was being transmitted to me through those flashing lights. Word by word, the message took shape on my crumpled receipt. Marcus. Do you remember the accident on Highway 67? My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Highway 67. 3 years ago. A night not unlike this one, with rain slicking the roads and making everything treacherous. I'd been coming back from a delivery in Dallas, tired and eager to get home, when I saw the car in my headlights. It had spun out on a curve, probably hit a patch of standing water and hydroplaned right into my lane. I'd swerved hard to the right, felt my trailer start to jackknife, and somehow managed to keep the rig upright as I rumbled onto the shoulder and finally came to a stop. When I'd climbed down from my cab and walked back to check on the other driver, I'd found the car empty. No driver, no passengers, just an old sedan sitting sideways across the center line with its engine still running and the driver's door standing open. The rain had been coming down harder then, and I'd called out into the darkness, thinking maybe whoever had been driving had been thrown clear, or had stumbled off into the woods in shock. I'd called the police, of course, and waited with them while they searched the area. They'd found tire tracks leading off into the trees, but no sign of a person. The car had been registered to someone named David Kellerman, and according to the investigating officer, Mr. Kellerman had died in a house fire 6 months earlier. The car should have been sitting in an impound lot in Little Rock, not spinning out in front of my truck on a rainy night in Arkansas. That whole incident had bothered me for months afterward. I'd even driven past the same spot a few times during daylight hours, looking for some clue I might have missed, some logical explanation for what had happened. But I'd never found one, and eventually I'd forced myself to stop thinking about it. Strange things happen on the road sometimes. Things that don't fit neatly into rational explanations. And sometimes it's better just to let them go. But now, as the blinkers continued their coded conversation, I was being forced to remember every detail of that night. The way the rain had sounded against my windshield, the smell of hot brakes and burning rubber, the eerie silence that had followed the screech of my tires as I'd pulled onto the shoulder. "You saved my life that night," the ledge continued. "I wanted to thank you." I fumbled for the CB again, my hands shaking as I keyed the microphone. "Listen, I don't know who you are or how you know about that night, but this isn't funny. If you want to talk, come up on the radio like a normal person." Static answered me, nothing else. But in my mirrors I could see the blinkers starting up again, patient and methodical as before. "There's something you need to know about tonight." The message that followed made me pull onto the next exit ramp and park in the lot of a closed gas station, my hands trembling too badly to keep driving safely. According to those flashing lights, there was going to be another accident on the highway ahead of me. A family in a minivan hydroplaning on "The Breath of the Mountain" from Samuel Morrison. The fog started rolling into my cab somewhere around mile marker 247 on Interstate 70, just as I was climbing through the Rockies on what should have been a clear October night. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the Continental Divide, and I'd never seen anything quite like it. The mist didn't come from outside my Peterbilt's windows where it belonged, seeping in through the usual places like door seals or vents. Instead, it seemed to materialize from within the cabin itself, appearing first as just a faint haze near my boots, before slowly, deliberately beginning to rise. At first I blamed the heater. The old girl had been acting up for weeks, and I figured maybe a coolant line had finally given way, releasing steam into the cab. But when I reached down to adjust the temperature controls, my hand passed through air that felt cold and damp, nothing like the dry heat that should have been pouring from a busted heating system. The fog felt different too, thicker somehow, with a weight that seemed to press against my skin like wet cotton. I rolled down both windows, letting the mountain air rush through the cabin, but the mysterious mist remained, unaffected by the wind that should have swept it away. The highway stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, illuminated only by my headlights cutting through the darkness. According to my GPS, the next truck stop wasn't for another 40 miles, and pulling over on these narrow mountain roads wasn't an option, especially not with a full load of appliances destined for Grand Junction. The fog in my cab continued to thicken, rising slowly past my knees and beginning to swirl around the gear shifter with an almost deliberate motion. I turned up the radio, hoping the late-night talk show would provide some distraction, but the voices seemed muffled and distant, as if the fog was absorbing the sound itself. As I shifted into a lower gear to navigate a particularly steep grade, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The fog wasn't just sitting there passively anymore. It was moving with purpose, forming slow, hypnotic patterns that reminded me of breathing. Long, steady inhales followed by extended exhales, as if the cabin itself had developed lungs. The temperature began to drop, and I could see my breath mixing with the mysterious mist, creating small clouds that danced in the glow of my dashboard lights. Miles passed in this strange, dreamlike state. The fog continued to rise, now reaching my chest and making it difficult to see my instruments clearly. I had to lean forward and peer through the haze to check my speed, my fuel gauge, the engine temperature readings that suddenly seemed critically important. The outside world had become a blur of pine trees and rocky outcroppings, occasionally lit by my headlights, but mostly hidden in the mountain darkness. The only constant was the steady hum of my diesel engine and the increasingly thick fog that now filled the upper portion of my cab. Then I began to hear something that shouldn't have been possible. Breathing that wasn't my own, slow and rhythmic, perfectly synchronized with the movement of the fog. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the sound of air moving through my truck's ventilation system, But as I listened more carefully, I could detect something unmistakably organic about it. The inhales were deep and patient, followed by exhales that seemed to carry a faint whisper, words just beyond the edge of comprehension. The fog had now risen to shoulder height, and I found myself hunched over the steering wheel, trying to keep my eyes above the mysterious mist that showed no signs of stopping its steady climb. My side mirrors had become useless, completely obscured, and even my rearview mirror reflected nothing but swirling gray. The breathing sounds grew more distinct, and I began to hear what sounded like whispered conversations. Multiple voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones about things I couldn't quite understand. As I rounded a sharp curve, my headlights caught something that made me question whether the fog might be affecting my vision in ways I hadn't considered. Standing beside the road, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing, a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat that belonged to another era. The person stood perfectly still, facing my truck, and as I passed I could have sworn they raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. But when I checked my mirrors, there was nothing but swirling fog and empty highway behind me. The voices in the cabin became clearer, though they still seemed to be speaking in a language just outside my understanding. They sounded urgent now, warning me about something ahead, something dangerous that I needed to avoid. The fog had reached my chin, and I was practically lying across the steering wheel, struggling to see the road through the small clear space near the windshield. My truck's air conditioning was running at full blast, but it had no effect on the supernatural mist that continued to fill my cab with its cold, damp presence. That's when I saw the lights ahead, flickering through the fog like distant stars. They appeared to be coming from a truck stop or rest area, exactly what I desperately needed. But as I drew closer, something felt wrong about those lights. They flickered with an irregular pattern, and their color was off, more yellow than the bright white of modern LED fixtures. The fog in my cabin seemed to react to them, swirling more frantically, and the whispered voices became agitated, their warnings more insistent. I began to slow my rig, preparing to pull into what I hoped would be a safe haven, where I could figure out what was happening to my truck. But as my headlights illuminated the structure ahead, I realized it wasn't a modern truck stop at all. The building looked decades old, with architectural details that suggested it had been built in the 1940s or 1950s. Old-style gas pumps stood like sentinels in front of a low, rambling structure with windows that glowed with that same sickly yellow light. And standing around those pumps, barely visible in the swirling mountain mist, were figures in period clothing, watching my approach with an attention that felt far too intense. The fog in my cabin suddenly surged upward, completely engulfing my head and making it impossible to see anything at all. The whispered voices became a chorus of warnings, telling me to keep driving, to not stop, to get as far away from this place as possible. My hands found the steering wheel by feel alone, and I pressed harder on the accelerator, trusting that I was still on the road, even though I couldn't see anything beyond the fog that now filled every inch of my cabin. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I drove blind through the supernatural mist, guided only by the feel of the truck beneath me and the desperate hope that I wouldn't veer off the mountain highway. The engine sound became my anchor, a steady reminder that my truck was still functioning, even if my world had been reduced to this gray, whispering void. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice that the fog was starting to thin, retreating slowly downward past my eyes, my shoulders, my chest. By the time I reached the next legitimate truck stop, the fog had completely disappeared, leaving no trace of its presence, except for a lingering chill and the faint smell of mountain pine that seemed to cling to my clothes. I pulled into the brightly lit parking area and sat in my cab for nearly an hour, hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. When I finally went inside to buy coffee and check with other drivers, no one could explain the fog. and several mentioned that the old truck stop I'd described had been abandoned for decades after a tragic accident in the 1950 S. I still drive that route regularly, and I've learned to watch for the fog that sometimes begins to form around mile marker 247. When it starts to appear in my cabin, I keep my windows down and my radio up, listening carefully to the whispered warnings that have, more than once, guided me safely past dangers I couldn't see. The voices in the fog aren't my enemies, I've come to understand. They're fellow travelers from another time, still trying to help drivers navigate the treacherous mountain roads they once knew so well. But I've never stopped again at that phantom truck stop, and I never intend to find out what might happen if I do. The weight of empty miles. From Marcus Chen. The cargo door had been acting up for 3 weeks now, and I'd been putting off the repair because freight was steady and downtime meant lost money. It wasn't much at first, just a gentle rattle when I hit the deeper potholes on Interstate 80. But by the time I was hauling through the Nevada desert that October night, the latch would pop open every 100 miles or so. I'd pull over, slam it shut, check the mechanism, and continue on my way. The trailer was empty anyway, heading back to Reno after delivering electronics to a warehouse in Salt Lake City, so I figured what harm could it do? The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, a moonless landscape of sagebrush and distant mountains that looked like sleeping giants against the star-heavy sky. My Peterbilt hummed steadily through the darkness, its diesel engine providing the only sound for miles around. The radio had lost signal an hour back, leaving me with nothing but the whisper of wind around the cab and the occasional tick of cooling metal when I'd stopped to secure that stubborn cargo door. Around 2 in the morning, somewhere between Fernley and Fallon, the door popped open again. I saw it in my mirrors, swinging wide like a mouth trying to swallow the road behind me. The trailer rocked slightly in the crosswind, and I could hear the hollow echo of empty space amplified by the open door. I pulled onto the shoulder with a sigh, the sound of gravel crunching under 18 wheels mixing with the distant call of a coyote. Walking back to close the door had become routine, but this time something felt different. The air was strangely still despite the earlier crosswind, and my footsteps seemed louder than they should have been on the packed earth beside the highway. When I reached the trailer, I noticed the interior wasn't completely empty as I'd assumed. There were wooden pallets stacked near the front, probably left over from the previous load, and their shadows created deep pockets of darkness that my flashlight beam couldn't quite penetrate. I grabbed the door handle and was about to swing it closed when I heard something from inside the trailer. Not a mechanical sound like shifting cargo or settling wood, but something organic. A soft rustling, like fabric brushing against metal, followed by what might have been a sigh. I stood there for a long moment, listening, my hand still gripping the cold metal handle. The sound came again, definitely from inside the trailer. And this time, it was accompanied by the faintest whisper of movement in the shadows between the pallets. My practical mind tried to explain it away. Maybe a piece of plastic sheeting left behind catching the air that flowed through the open door. Maybe a small animal that had gotten trapped inside during loading. But something deeper than logic was telling me to close that door and get back on the road immediately. Instead, I found myself stepping up into the trailer, my flashlight beam dancing across the corrugated walls and wooden floor. The trailer felt larger than it should have, as if the simple act of stepping inside had somehow expanded the space around me. My footsteps echoed strangely, taking just a fraction of a second too long to fade away. The pallets were stacked 3 high near the front wall, creating a maze of narrow passages and hidden corners. As I moved deeper into the trailer, my light caught something that made me stop abruptly. There were muddy footprints on the floor, leading from the back doors toward the front of the trailer. But that was impossible. The trailer had been sealed when I picked it up, and I'd been the only one with access since then. The prints were larger than mine, made by boots with a distinctive tread pattern that left clear impressions in the thin layer of dust that coated the floor. They seemed fresh, the edges sharp and well-defined. I followed the trail with my flashlight, my heartbeat growing faster with each step. The footprints led around the stacked pallets and disappeared into the darkest corner of the trailer, where my light struggled to reach. As I approached that corner, the air seemed to grow thicker, almost viscous, and I could smell something I couldn't quite identify. Not exactly unpleasant, but wrong somehow, like wet earth mixed with something metallic. The rustling sound came again, much closer now, and I spun toward it with my flashlight. The beam caught movement between two pallets, just a glimpse of something that might have been fabric or hair, there and gone so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd seen anything at all. My throat felt dry, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. When I tried to call out, to demand that whoever was in there show themselves, my voice came out as barely a whisper. That's when I heard it clearly. A voice, speaking my name, not loudly, but with perfect clarity in the hollow space of the trailer. "Marcus," it said, drawn out like a sigh. "Marcus." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, reflected off the metal walls until I couldn't tell where it originated. It sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it. Like someone I'd known long ago, calling to me from across years of forgotten time. I backed toward the open door, my light sweeping frantically across the pallets and shadows. The voice followed me, saying my name again and again, sometimes barely audible, sometimes clear as if the speaker were standing right beside me. When I reached the door, I jumped down to the gravel and slammed it shut with shaking hands. The metallic bang echoed across the desert, and then everything was silent except for the idle rumble of my truck's engine. I walked back to the cab on unsteady legs, checking my mirrors obsessively as I pulled back onto the highway. The trailer door stayed closed for almost 50 miles, long enough for me to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, too much caffeine, too many long nights on the road. The mind could play terrible tricks when pushed to its limits. But then I saw it in my passenger mirror. The door swinging open again, revealing the black interior of the trailer. And this time, there was definitely something moving inside. Not just shadows or tricks of light, but a figure standing among the pallets, tall and still, facing toward the back of the trailer as if looking directly at me through the mirror. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the slightly less dark interior, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was watching me. Pulled over again, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The logical thing to do was call dispatch, report a stowaway, maybe contact the highway patrol, but something told me that whatever was in my trailer wouldn't be there when the authorities arrived. This was between me and it, whatever it was. I sat in the cab for 10 minutes, engine running, watching that dark figure in my mirror. It never moved, never shifted position, just stood there in the trailer like a patient sentinel. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a tire iron from behind my seat and walked back to the trailer. The figure was gone, but the muddy footprints had multiplied. They covered the floor now, overlapping and crisscrossing in patterns that hurt to look at. Some looked fresh, others seemed to fade even as I watched. The voice started again as I stood in the doorway, but this time it wasn't saying my name. It was speaking words I couldn't understand, in a language that sounded like wind through empty spaces. I slammed the door and secured it with a length of chain I kept in my toolbox, wrapping it around the handles and locking it with a heavy padlock. The trailer stayed sealed for the rest of the run into Reno, but I could hear things moving around inside, footsteps pacing back and forth, the scrape of pallets being moved, sometimes soft laughter that seemed to come through the walls of the cab itself. When I reached the depot, I opened the trailer in front of the dock supervisor and two other drivers. It was completely empty, clean as a whistle, with no trace of the muddy footprints or anything else. The pallets were gone too, though I never saw them being removed. Everyone agreed the latch mechanism needed replacing, and they sent the rig to the shop while I took a few days off. I never drove that particular trailer again, but I kept in touch with other drivers who did. Most reported no problems, but a few mentioned the door opening on its own during empty runs. One driver, an old-timer named Bill Santos, told me he'd heard voices inside the trailer while hauling through Wyoming. Another said he'd seen footprints in the dusk just like I had. The company eventually retired the trailer after a driver abandoned it at a truck stop in Colorado, claiming something had been trying to get out from the inside. I still haul freight across the desert, but now I always make sure my cargo doors are properly secured, and I never investigate strange sounds alone. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, when the highway stretches empty ahead of me, I think I can hear that voice calling my name from somewhere far behind me, carried on the wind that follows every truck driver through the long, dark, the thing that breathed beneath the asphalt. From Marcus Rivera. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the pale glow of my headlights, and I had been driving this same route between Denver and Salt Lake City for nearly 8 years without incident. Tonight felt different, though, heavy with the kind of atmospheric pressure that comes before a storm, even though the Weather Service had promised clear skies all the way through Utah. My Peterbilt 379 hummed its familiar diesel lullaby, the engine's steady rhythm usually enough to keep me alert through these long midnight hauls, but something about the darkness beyond my windshield seemed thicker than usual, as if the night itself had weight. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts on the airwaves. But mostly I drove in that peculiar solitude that only long-haul truckers truly understand. Mile marker 247 passed by in a blur, then 248, and I settled into that meditative state where the road becomes everything and nothing simultaneously. The cargo behind me, 30,000 pounds of electronics bound for a warehouse in Provo, shifted slightly as I navigated a gentle curve, the trailer tracking smoothly behind my cab like it had done thousands of times before. That's when I felt the first bump, right around mile marker 251, just as I was reaching for my thermos of coffee. It wasn't unusual for the interstate to have rough patches, places where the asphalt had settled unevenly or where construction crews had left imperfect seams, but this bump felt different somehow. It resonated through the cab with a hollow quality, as if I'd driven over something that had given way beneath the weight of my rig, something that had been holding its breath and suddenly exhaled. The coffee sloshed in my thermos as I set it back in the cup holder, and I checked my mirrors instinctively, looking for signs of tire damage or loose cargo, but everything appeared normal in the red glow of my taillights. The road behind me stretched empty and unremarkable, just the same weathered asphalt that had carried millions of vehicles safely across this desolate stretch of Colorado Plateau country. Still, something nagged at me, a feeling that reminded me of childhood nights when I'd lie in bed convinced something was watching me from the darkness of my closet. 3 miles later I hit another bump, this one more pronounced, and as my cab jolted upward slightly, I could have sworn I heard something underneath the normal sounds of diesel engine and road noise. It was a low rumble, almost subsonic, like distant thunder, or the growl of some massive animal disturbed from sleep. The rational part of my mind immediately cataloged possible explanations. Air brakes settling, transmission fluid responding to temperature changes, the hollow resonance of a bridge underpass I might not have noticed in the darkness. But deep in my chest, in that primal place where instinct lives, I knew I'd heard something that didn't belong to my truck or the road. The sound had seemed to come from below, from somewhere underneath the asphalt itself, as if something large and alive dwelt in the earth beneath the highway, and my passing had disturbed its rest. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, the familiar texture of the worn leather suddenly feeling less comforting than it had moments before. The headlight swept across another mile marker, and I realized I'd been unconsciously slowing down, my foot easing off the accelerator as my body responded to a danger my conscious mind hadn't yet accepted. The speedometer needle hovered at 55 instead of my usual 70, and other than a single set of taillights disappearing over a distant hill, I seemed to be alone on this stretch of highway. The CB radio had gone quiet. Not even the usual late-night chatter from insomniacs and cross-country marathoners breaking the electronic silence. When the third bump came, there was no mistaking the sound that accompanied it. A growl, deep and resonant and unmistakably organic, rose from beneath my truck, as if something enormous had awakened and taken offense at the weight pressing down on its hiding place. The sound seemed to follow my wheels, traveling along underneath the trailer in a way that made my skin prickle with goosebumps despite the cab's warmth. I felt the distinct sensation of being noticed, of having attracted the attention of something that had been sleeping in the darkness beneath the road. My CB radio suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static, and through the white noise I heard what might have been a voice, distorted and unintelligible, speaking words in a cadence that didn't sound quite human. The transmission lasted only a few seconds before dissolving back into electronic silence, but it left me with the unsettling impression that something had been trying to communicate, trying to warn me, or perhaps call to whatever was tracking my progress from below. The fourth bump was violent enough to rattle my teeth, and this time the growl that accompanied it was unmistakably closer to the surface. I could feel vibrations through the steering wheel, through the seat, through the very air inside the cab, as if something massive was pushing upward against the asphalt, testing its strength, probing for weaknesses. The road ahead looked normal in my headlights, the same faded yellow lines and gray surface that had carried me safely across thousands of miles, but I found myself scanning for irregularities, for any sign that the pavement might be compromised. That's when I saw the crack, hairline thin at first, running parallel to my path about 20 feet ahead. As my headlights swept over it, the crack seemed to widen slightly, as if responding to my approach, and I could have sworn I saw something moving in the darkness of that narrow fissure. The growling intensified, no longer coming in bursts with the bumps, but maintaining a steady, rumbling presence that seemed to surround my truck, as if whatever lurked beneath had awakened fully and was now pacing me, keeping perfect time with my forward progress. My hands shook slightly as I reached for the CB radio, desperate for human contact, for someone else's voice to cut through the supernatural dread that was building in my chest like pressure in a diving bell. But when I keyed the microphone, all that came back was static, punctuated by that same distorted voice, speaking what might have been words of warning or invitation, impossible to tell which. The mile markers continued to pass, but I'd lost track of my location, my attention focused entirely on the growing network of cracks that was spreading across the asphalt ahead of me like a spider web of broken pavement. The fifth bump lifted my truck entirely off the ground for a split second, and, in that moment of weightlessness, I felt something brush against the undercarriage with enough force to make the entire rig shudder. The growl became a roar, no longer muffled by earth and asphalt, but clear and present and absolutely enormous. The sound of something that had never been meant to share the world with human beings. Through my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of the road surface behind me buckling and heaving, as if massive shoulders were shrugging beneath the pavement. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, my Peterbilt responding with a surge of diesel power that pushed me back into my seat. But the thing beneath matched my acceleration effortlessly, its roaring growing louder and more insistent as the cracks in the asphalt began to spider outward from directly beneath my trailer. In the glow of my taillights reflected in the mirrors, I could see chunks of pavement lifting and falling back down, creating a wake of destruction that followed my path with predatory precision. The road ahead curved gently to the right, and as I took the turn at dangerous speed, my trailer swaying slightly but holding the line, I felt a moment of desperate hope that I might be able to outrun whatever was pursuing me from below. But as my headlights swept across the curve, They illuminated something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The asphalt was already cracked here too, a complex pattern of fractures that suggested whatever dwelt beneath had been tracking my route, anticipating my path, preparing an ambush ahead of my arrival. That's when I saw the overpass in the distance, a concrete bridge spanning the highway like salvation made manifest, and I realized that whatever was hunting me from below might not be able to follow me across that gap. I pushed my truck harder than I'd ever pushed it before, the engine roaring in protest as the speedometer climbed past 80, past 85, the trailer behind me swaying dangerously but holding together through sheer momentum and desperate prayer. The roaring from beneath reached a crescendo as I approached the bridge, and I felt my truck lift again, this time staying airborne for what felt like an eternity, suspended above a section of highway that was buckling and heaving like an earthquake fault line. Through my mirrors, I saw the asphalt split completely, revealing a darkness so profound it seemed to absorb the light from my taillights. And from that darkness came a sound that was part roar, part shriek, part something else entirely that had no name in human language. The film, from Marcus Rivera. I'd been driving these highways for 23 years and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Ice storms that turned the asphalt into a skating rink, fog so thick you couldn't see your own headlights reflecting back, and enough strange characters at truck stops to fill a dozen horror movies. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened with that coffee mug during my run through Montana last October. The mug itself wasn't special, just a standard ceramic piece I'd picked up at a gas station in Billings, white with faded blue lettering that read, "World's Best Trucker," in that generic font they slap on everything. I'd been nursing my usual black coffee through the afternoon, making decent time on Interstate 94 with a load of furniture bound for Seattle. The weather was cooperating, clear skies with that crisp autumn air that makes you grateful to be alive and on the road. I pulled into a rest stop just outside Forsyth as the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of RVs parked at the far end and a lone sedan with Nevada plates. I always preferred the quiet stops anyway, where you could hear yourself think and the diesel fumes hadn't built up into a choking cloud. After checking my logs and securing the load, I climbed into the sleeper berth of my Peterbilt, that familiar sanctuary I'd called home more nights than my actual apartment. The mug sat on the small, fold-down table next to my bunk, empty except for the brown rings staining the bottom, where the last drops of coffee had dried. I remember looking at it before settling in for my mandatory rest period, thinking I should probably rinse it out before morning. But fatigue was setting in, that bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting crosswinds for 8 hours straight, and I figured it could wait until I hit the next truck stop. Sleep came quickly, helped along by the gentle rocking of the cab whenever another truck passed on the interstate. I'd long ago grown accustomed to sleeping through the ambient noise of the highway, the occasional air brake hiss, and the low rumble of idling engines. It was better than any white noise machine, that symphony of the road that had lulled me to sleep in rest stops from Maine to California. But sometime in the deep hours of night, something pulled me from sleep. Not a sound exactly, more like a presence, the way you can sense when someone's watching you in a crowded room. I lay there in the darkness of the sleeper berth, listening to the steady tick of my engine cooling and the distant whisper of late-night traffic. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I reached for the small LED reading light clipped to the wall and clicked it on. The weak beam cast familiar shadows across the cramped space, illuminating my thermos, logbook, and the small pile of paperwork that follows every driver like a faithful dog. And there, sitting on the fold-down table, exactly where I'd left it, was the coffee mug. Only now it was full. Not just full, but filled to the brim with what appeared to be fresh, hot coffee. Steam rose from the surface in lazy spirals, and I could smell that rich, bitter aroma that every trucker knows by heart. The ceramic felt warm to the touch when I tentatively reached out, and the liquid inside was dark as motor oil, no cream or sugar, exactly the way I'd been drinking it for 2 decades. My first thought was that I'd simply forgotten emptying and refilling it before bed, but I knew that wasn't true. The rest stop didn't have coffee facilities beyond a pair of broken vending machines, and I'd finished off my thermos hours earlier. Besides, the mug had been bone dry when I glanced at it before falling asleep. I was certain of that detail. I sat up in the narrow bunk, running my hands through my hair and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind suggested sleepwalking, though I'd never been prone to it in my life. Maybe I'd gotten up in a drowsy haze, made coffee somehow, and simply didn't remember. But even as I considered the possibility, I knew it didn't hold water. I didn't have any coffee grounds in the truck, hadn't had any for weeks since switching to the pre-made stuff in my thermos. The coffee in the mug looked perfect, like something you'd get from a high-end cafe rather than the bitter swill that passes for coffee at most truck stops. The surface was smooth as glass, reflecting the LED light like a dark mirror. I found myself staring into it, mesmerized by the way the light seemed to sink into the depths, rather than bounce back. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made me want to lean closer and peer deeper into that midnight surface. That's when I noticed the other things. The air in the sleeper berth had grown noticeably colder, cold enough that I could see my breath misting when I exhaled. The windows, which had been clear when I'd bedded down, were now fogged with condensation despite the dry Montana night. And underneath the rich smell of coffee there was something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of standing water and old leaves. I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door and shrugged it on, the familiar weight of the denim comforting against the growing strangeness of the situation. Through the fogged windshield, I could make out the rest stop's single security light casting its weak yellow glow across the empty parking area. The RVs and sedan were gone, leaving my truck alone in the vast Montana darkness. That should have been my first real warning. Truck stops, even small ones, never emptied completely during the night. There were always a few drivers catching mandatory rest, RV travelers stretching their gas money, or insomniacs nursing coffee and watching the world go by. The complete absence of any other vehicles felt wrong, like waking up to find your hometown deserted. I decided to get dressed and walk around the truck, maybe clear my head with some fresh air and figure out what was happening. But as I reached for the door handle of the sleeper berth, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The sound of liquid being poured, slow, steady, deliberate, the unmistakable glug, glug, glug of coffee filling a container. I turned back toward the fold-down table, and the mug was overflowing. Dark coffee cascaded over the rim in a steady stream, pooling on the table and dripping onto the floor of the cab. But here's the thing that still gives me nightmares when I think about it. There was no source for the liquid, no pot, no thermos, no invisible hand holding anything above the mug. The coffee was simply appearing, materializing out of empty air and filling the cup beyond capacity. The overflow spread across the table with unnatural speed, moving like it had a purpose rather than simply following gravity. It reached the edges and began dripping onto my logbook, staining the pages with dark spots that looked disturbingly like blood in the LED's harsh light. The smell in the compact space was becoming overwhelming, no longer the pleasant aroma of fresh coffee, but something bitter and acrid that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. I grabbed the mug, thinking to dump it outside, but the ceramic was scalding hot, hot enough to make me drop it with a curse. It hit the floor with a solid thunk, but didn't break, didn't even crack. Instead, it rolled in a tight circle before coming to rest upright, still full to the brim despite having been inverted. Coffee continued to pour from the invisible source, faster now, creating a spreading pool that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The temperature in the sleeper berth dropped further, cold enough now that frost was forming on the inside of the windows. My breath came in sharp puffs as I fumbled for my boots, suddenly desperate to get out of the confined space. The sound of pouring liquid was growing louder, joined now by something that might have been whispers. Voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood was not meant for human ears. I yanked open the door of the sleeper berth and practically fell into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I reached for the ignition. The familiar rumble of the Cummins engine turning over was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, drowning out the whispers and the endless pouring. I flipped on every light I had, illuminating the cab in harsh white brilliance that pushed back the shadows, but couldn't quite eliminate the cold. Through the rearview mirror, I could see coffee still flowing from the sleeper berth, running in dark rivulets down the steps and pooling beneath the truck. In the mirror's reflection, the liquid seemed to move with deliberate purpose, forming patterns and shapes that hurt to look at directly. I threw the truck into drive and peeled out of the rest stop like the devil himself was on my package for the void. From Marcus Chen. The GPS coordinates led me down a highway that shouldn't have existed, but truckers learn not to question technology when deadlines are breathing down your neck. I'd been driving my Kenworth T880 for 18 hours straight, chasing a delivery that paid triple the usual rate for what the manifest listed simply as fragile household items. The customer had specified night delivery only, which wasn't unusual in my line of work, but something about the whole arrangement felt off from the moment I'd loaded the unmarked boxes at the warehouse in Bakersfield. The rain had been my constant companion since crossing into Nevada, a steady drumming against the windshield that made the world beyond my headlights look like it was melting. My CB radio crackled with the usual chatter of long haulers discussing weight stations and weather conditions, their voices a comforting reminder that I wasn't the only soul navigating these dark arteries of asphalt. The engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby, 18 cylinders working in perfect harmony to pull me deeper into the desert night. According to my GPS, I should reach the delivery address in 47 minutes, but the landscape outside told a different story. Instead of the suburban development I'd expected based on the address, endless scrubland stretched in every direction, punctuated only by the occasional cluster of Joshua trees that stood like twisted sentinels in the darkness. The highway itself seemed newer than it should be, the yellow lines too bright, the asphalt too smooth for this remote stretch of nowhere. I tried calling the customer number from my paperwork, but my cell phone showed no signal bars. Not unusual out here in the desert, but the timing felt inconvenient. The delivery window was narrow, and I'd already pushed my driving hours to the legal limit. Missing this delivery would mean losing the bonus that would cover my truck payment for the next 2 months. The GPS announced in its mechanical voice that I should take the next exit, but when I looked for off-ramp signs, there were none. Just a narrow road that branched away from the highway at a gentle angle, unmarked and uninviting. I slowed the rig and made the turn, feeling the trailer shift slightly as we left the smooth highway for rougher pavement. The road was barely wide enough for my truck, with no shoulder to speak of, just gravel that disappeared into darkness on both sides. My headlights carved through the rain and revealed a landscape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The scrub brush looked dead, branches reaching toward the road like gnarled fingers. I'd driven through plenty of desolate country in my 15 years behind the wheel, but this place felt different. It felt hungry. The road curved and twisted in ways that made no sense, doubling back on itself without apparent reason. I checked my odometer and realized I'd been driving on this back road for nearly an hour, far longer than the GPS had indicated. When I glanced at the navigation screen, the little truck icon sat in the middle of a gray void, no roads or landmarks visible. The screen flickered occasionally, showing brief glimpses of a map that looked hand-drawn rather than digital, with symbols I didn't recognize marking locations that shouldn't exist. That's when I noticed the houses. They appeared gradually, like images developing in a dark room, First, just the suggestion of structures in the distance, then clearer outlines as I drew closer. They were arranged along the road at irregular intervals, each one set back behind overgrown yards that my headlights couldn't fully penetrate. The houses themselves looked wrong somehow, as if they'd been built by someone who had only heard descriptions of houses, but had never actually seen one. Windows were placed at odd heights, doors seemed too narrow, and roof lines followed angles that hurt to look at directly. None of the houses showed any signs of life. No porch lights, no warm glow from windows, no cars in the driveways, but mailboxes stood at the end of each driveway, and as I passed them, I could make out numbers painted in reflective paint. The sequence was all wrong, jumping from 247 to 891 to 1456, without any apparent pattern. I was looking for 2847 Sagebrush Lane, according to my delivery papers. The rain intensified, and I had to lean forward to peer through the windshield despite the wipers working at full speed. The road surface had deteriorated into something that might have been gravel once, but now felt more like driving on broken bones. Each pothole sent shivers through the trailer, and I found myself worrying about the mysterious cargo shifting around back there. I'd been driving for what felt like hours when I finally saw it. A mailbox with 2847 painted in numbers that seemed to glow with their own pale light. The house beyond was larger than the others, a rambling structure that seemed to unfold in impossible directions the longer I looked at it. Unlike the other houses, this one showed signs of occupancy. Warm yellow light spilled from several windows, and smoke drifted from a chimney that appeared to be located in 3 different places depending on the angle from which I viewed it. I pulled into the driveway, which was long enough that the house disappeared from view behind a grove of trees that hadn't been there moments before. When the structure came back into view, it looked different, as if someone had rearranged the rooms while I wasn't watching. I backed the trailer up to what appeared to be a loading dock, though I couldn't remember seeing one when I'd first spotted the house. Before I could shut off the engine, a figure emerged from the house. It was difficult to make out details in the rain and darkness, but they appeared to be an elderly person, wearing what might have been a bathrobe. They approached the passenger side of my cab, and I rolled down the window. "You're right on time," they said, and their voice carried clearly despite the rain and diesel rumble. I was beginning to worry the shipment wouldn't arrive. "You're the customer for this address?" I asked, consulting my paperwork. The name listed was J. Morrison, but when I looked up to confirm, the figure was already walking toward the trailer. "Everything's here, I trust," they called back. "The items are very important to me. I've been waiting such a long time." I climbed down from the cab, my boots splashing in puddles that reflected no light despite being surrounded by illumination from the house windows. The customer was already at the trailer doors, running their hands over the locks with what seemed like eager anticipation. Up close I could see that their bathrobe was actually an elaborate dressing gown, covered in patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "I'll need you to sign for the delivery," I said, pulling out my electronic clipboard, but when I looked at the screen, the delivery information had changed. Instead of household items, the manifest now listed contents as memories borrowed and time reconstituted and dreams slightly used. The customer took the clipboard and signed with a flourish, but the signature they left behind wasn't letters or numbers. It was a symbol that hurt to look at, something that suggested dimensions beyond the normal 3. When they handed the device back, their fingers felt cold, even through my work gloves. "The boxes go in the basement," they said. "I'll show you the way." But when I opened the trailer doors, the cargo area was no longer filled with the unmarked boxes I'd loaded in Bakersfield. Instead, the trailer contained dozens of glass containers, each one filled with what looked like swirling fog or maybe liquid starlight. Some containers held objects I almost recognized, A child's toy, a wedding ring, a photograph. But they all seem to exist slightly outside of normal reality. I don't think this is right, I started to say, but the customer was already reaching for one of the containers. The moment their fingers made contact with the glass, I heard something that might have been singing. If songs could be made of loneliness and regret, that's when I realized the rain had stopped, but I could still hear it drumming against metal. I looked up and saw that we were no longer outside. The trailer was parked inside a vast warehouse, or maybe a cavern, the walls disappearing into shadow beyond the reach of any light. The ceiling was so high I couldn't make it out, but I could hear the rain falling somewhere up there in the darkness. Endless precipitation in an enclosed space that shouldn't exist. "This isn't possible," I whispered, but my words seemed to be absorbed by the air before they could travel more than a few inches. The customer smiled, and I saw that they had too many teeth, each one a different shape and size, as if they'd been collected from various sources rather than grown naturally. "Possibility is such a limiting concept," they said. "I prefer to think in terms of inevitability." I backed toward the cab of my truck, but the distance seemed to stretch with each step I took. The customer began unloading the containers, and with each one they touched, I heard more voices join that impossible chorus. Some sounded human, others distinctly did not, but all of them carried the weight of things lost and never recovery. The passenger who never came. From Marcus. I've been hauling freight across the interstate highways for nearly 15 years now, and in all that time behind the wheel of my Peterbilt, I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. The drunk drivers weaving between lanes at 3 in the morning, the sudden fog banks that roll in like ghosts across the asphalt, the way shadows play tricks on tired eyes when you've been driving for 10 hours straight. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on that humid August night somewhere between Little Rock and Memphis. The air conditioning in my cab had been acting up for weeks, cycling between Arctic blasts and broken wheeze. So I'd taken to driving with the windows cracked, just enough to let the night air circulate. The radio was tuned to some distant AM station, playing old country songs, the kind that drift in and out depending on atmospheric conditions and how many mountains stand between you and the broadcast tower. Willie Nelson was singing about blue eyes crying in the rain when I first noticed the passenger seatbelt. It wasn't buckled when I'd started my drive that evening. I'm absolutely certain of that detail because I have a habit, maybe you'd call it superstitious, of checking the passenger seat before every long haul. Some drivers keep a thermos there, others pile up paperwork or snacks, but I've always preferred to keep that space clear, clean. It feels safer somehow, like keeping that seat empty means I'm in complete control of my rig and everything in it. The belt was just hanging loose against the seat back, the way seat belts do when no one's using them. The metal buckle caught the green glow from my dashboard occasionally when I'd glance over to check my mirrors or reach for my coffee. Normal. Ordinary. Nothing worth thinking about twice. But somewhere around mile marker 127, with the Arkansas countryside rolling past in the darkness, and the humid air carrying the scent of wet earth and distant rain through my cracked windows, I heard it. The soft, metallic click of a seatbelt engaging. The sound was so quiet it almost got lost beneath the steady rumble of my engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt, but I caught it, that distinct little snap that happens when the middle tongue slides into the buckle and locks into place. I looked over at the passenger seat, and sure enough, the belt was fastened. The black fabric stretched taut across the empty seat, holding nothing but shadows and that persistent feeling that something had just changed in my cab. My first thought was vibration. These big rigs shake and bounce enough to rattle your teeth loose on rough stretches of highway, and maybe the constant motion had somehow worked the belt into the buckle. Stranger things have happened. I reached over and pressed the release button. The belt retracted, with its familiar whirring sound settling back against the seat. Problem solved, I told myself, and turned my attention back to the road ahead. The headlights of an oncoming car swept past, briefly illuminating the truck stop billboard advertising coffee and diesel 20 miles ahead. Normal night, normal drive, just the kind of mechanical quirk that comes with spending your life in a machine that's seen more miles than most people see in a lifetime. 20 minutes later, I heard the click again. This time, I was ready for it, and I turned to look at the passenger seat immediately. The belt was buckled, that same taut stretch across empty space, but now I could swear I saw the slightest impression in the seat cushion. Not deep, just the barest suggestion that weight was resting there. The kind of subtle dent you might get from a small person, or maybe a large bag of something soft. But there was nothing on the seat, nothing visible anyway. The radio crackled with static for a moment, Willie Nelson's voice fading in and out like he was singing from the bottom of a well, before the signal cleared and returned to normal. I sat there with one hand on the wheel, staring at that buckled seatbelt, trying to work out some rational explanation. Maybe the seat cushion was just old, worn in a way that made it look compressed. Maybe the combination of vibration and air pressure changes was causing the belt to engage on its own. These explanations felt thin, even as I thought them, but what was the alternative? I unbuckled the belt again, this time making sure to tuck the metal tongue down into the crack between the seat and backrest, where it couldn't possibly work its way loose. Then I adjusted my mirrors, checked my speed, and focused on the road with the determined concentration of a man trying very hard not to think about impossible things. The highway stretched ahead in a long, gentle curve through pine forests that pressed close to both sides of the asphalt. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the yellow lines that seemed to flow toward me like a river of light. The engine hummed its steady song, 8 cylinders firing in perfect rhythm, while the air conditioning wheezed back to life and began pumping cool air into the cab. I was just starting to relax when the belt clicked again. Not only was it buckled, but this time I could clearly see the impression in the seat. The cushion was definitely compressed, forming the outline of someone sitting there. Someone small, judging by the size of the impression, maybe a woman or a teenage kid. The seatbelt stretched across this invisible passenger, holding them securely in place according to all traffic safety regulations. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead despite the air conditioning, and my heart was doing things that probably weren't healthy for a man my age. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that I needed to pull over, get out of the cab, walk around the truck a few times and clear my head. Maybe grab some coffee at that truck stop still 15 miles ahead. But another part of me, a deeper part, that remembered childhood fears of dark closets and things that went bump in the night, was absolutely certain that stopping would be the worst possible idea. Whatever was sitting in my passenger seat, buckled in, safe and sound for the journey, might not appreciate being disturbed. The radio started acting up again, cycling through stations without any input from me. Scattered fragments of late-night talk shows and oldies music mixed with bursts of static, creating an unsettling audio collage that filled the cab. Through it all, I kept glancing at that passenger seat, watching the way the seatbelt held its invisible cargo in place. Then, as we crested a small hill and began the descent toward a bridge spanning some nameless river, I felt the truck pull slightly to the right. Not much, just enough that I had to correct with the steering wheel to keep us centered in our lane. It was the kind of drift you might get if someone had shifted their weight in the passenger seat, leaning toward the window to get a better look at something outside. I checked my mirrors, scanned the landscape for whatever might have caught my passenger's attention, but saw nothing except dark trees and the occasional farmhouse light twinkling in the distance. The truck straightened out as I held the wheel steady, but I could feel a presence now. Not malevolent exactly, but definitely there. Someone riding along, buckled in for safety, sharing the journey through the Arkansas night. The miles rolled by in a strange kind of suspended tension. I found myself driving more carefully than usual, taking the curves a little slower, braking more gently for traffic lights in the small towns we passed through, After all, I had a passenger to think about now. Someone who'd taken the trouble to buckle their seatbelt and settle in for the ride. As we approached Memphis, the traffic began to thicken even at this late hour. More trucks joining the convoy, cars with late shift workers heading home. The general increase in activity that comes with getting close to a major city. I was keeping pace with a convoy of refrigerated trucks when I happened to glance at the passenger seat and saw that my invisible rider was gone. The seatbelt hung loose and unbuckled, exactly the way it should be. The seat cushion showed no impression, no sign that anyone had been sitting there. Even the air in the cab felt different, less crowded somehow. Whatever presence had joined me for those strange miles through the Arkansas darkness had apparently reached their destination. I made my delivery in Memphis without incident, grabbed a few hours of sleep in a truck stop parking lot, and started the return journey the next evening. As I passed back through that same stretch of highway where my invisible passenger had first buckled in, I found myself checking the passenger seat every few minutes, but the belt remained unbuckled, the seat empty, and the only presence in the cab was my own. Still, even now, months later, I keep that passenger seat clear, clean, ready, because somewhere out there in the network of highways that spider across this country, there might be someone waiting for a ride, someone who knows enough about road safety to buckle their seatbelt even if they can't manage to be seen while they do it. And honestly, after 15 years of driving alone through the long, dark hours when the rest of the world is sleeping, I think I'd welcome the company, The Gentle Wash. From Marcus. The neon sign flickered against the desert night like a dying heartbeat, casting pink and blue shadows across the cracked asphalt of the truck stop. I'd been driving for 14 straight hours, hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Denver, and my rig was coated in a thick layer of dust and grime that made the windshield look like frosted glass. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the last 50 miles, and the only station I could pick up was playing old country songs that seemed to drift in and out like ghosts in the signal. That's when I saw it, tucked behind the main building like a secret someone forgot to keep. The truck wash bay stood under a canopy of rusted metal, illuminated by a series of fluorescent bulbs that hummed with an electrical tune that seemed almost melodic in the stillness. A hand-painted sign swayed gently in the desert breeze, the words, "Gentle Wash," like new skin, painted in flowing script that reminded me of my grandmother's careful hand. Something about that phrase struck me as odd, but fatigue has a way of making everything seem strange when you've been on the road long enough. The main building's windows glowed yellow with warmth, and I could see the silhouette of the attendant behind the counter, a thin figure that moved with deliberate slowness as they organized something I couldn't quite make out. I pulled my 18-wheeler up to the fuel pumps first, the diesel engine settling into its familiar, rumbling idle that had become as comforting as a lullaby over the years. The night air carried the scent of sage and something else, something sweet and chemical that reminded me of the beauty parlor where my mother used to get her hair done, all ammonia and floral perfume mixed together in a way that was both pleasant and unsettling. Inside the building, the attendant looked up from their work with eyes that seemed too bright under the fluorescent lighting. They were neither young nor old, with skin that had a peculiar smoothness to it, like porcelain that had been polished until it gleamed. Their smile was warm and genuine, and when they spoke, their voice carried a slight accent that I couldn't place, something that might have been southern or maybe southwestern, with vowels that stretched like taffy in the desert heat. "Evening, driver," they said, their hands folded neatly on the counter. "Long haul tonight, I'm guessing. Your truck's looking mighty dusty out there. We've got a special wash that'll make her shine like she just rolled off the lot. Gentle process, very thorough. Most drivers say it's like getting new skin for their rigs." There was that phrase again, and something about the way they emphasized the word gentle made the hair on the back of my neck stand up just slightly. But the attendant's smile was so warm, and the thought of driving another 6 hours with a windshield I could barely see through was enough to overcome whatever strange feeling was creeping up my spine. I paid the wash fee, a surprisingly reasonable amount for what they promised was their premium service, and followed their directions around to the back of the building. The wash bay was larger than it had appeared from the parking lot, stretching back into shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been under the bright lights. The concrete floor was polished smooth and sloped gently toward drains that gleamed like silver coins in the artificial illumination. Along the walls, hoses and brushes hung from hooks with mechanical precision, and there was something about their arrangement that reminded me of surgical instruments laid out for an opera. The air inside the bay was warm and humid, carrying that same sweet chemical scent, but stronger now, mixed with the metallic taste of ozone that comes before a thunderstorm. As I positioned my truck according to the painted lines on the floor, I noticed that the walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them arranged in neat rows like a gallery exhibition. Each photo showed a different truck, and they all shared the same impossibly pristine appearance, their paint jobs gleaming with a depth and richness that seemed almost organic. Chrome bumpers reflected the camera flash like mirrors, and every surface appeared to have been polished to perfection. What struck me as strange, though, was that many of the trucks in the photos were older models, rigs that should have shown their age in rust spots and faded paint, but instead looked as though they had been completely renewed. The wash system activated automatically once I was in position, and the first sensation was the gentle hum of water beginning to flow through hidden pipes in the ceiling. The spray that descended was warm and oddly viscous, not quite like regular water, but thicker somehow, like the mineral water from hot springs that coats your skin with a silky feeling. The droplets that hit my windshield didn't run off immediately, but seemed to cling and spread, creating patterns that were almost hypnotic to watch. Through the side mirror, I could see the liquid coating the sides of my trailer, and where it touched, the accumulated dust and grime began to dissolve in a way that was both fascinating and unsettling. The chemical smell grew stronger as the wash progressed, and I found myself becoming drowsy despite the strangeness of the situation. The warm air in the cab, combined with the rhythmic sound of the washing system and the gentle vibration of liquid against metal, created an almost womb-like environment that made my eyelids heavy. But every time I started to drift off, something would catch my attention and snap me back to alertness. The sound of the brushes engaging with my truck's surface was softer than expected, less like bristles against metal and more like fingers stroking skin. It was then that I noticed the liquid running off my truck wasn't the dirty brown or gray color you'd expect from washing road grime away. Instead, it was a pale pink that grew darker as it swirled toward the drains, carrying with it what looked like flakes of something that definitely wasn't dirt. The flakes were thin and translucent, and as they caught the light, they shimmed with an iridescent quality that made my stomach turn. I pressed my face against the side window, trying to get a better look at what was coming off my truck, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The washing solution wasn't just removing the accumulated dust and debris from my rig's surface. It was removing the paint itself, layer by layer, but somehow revealing something underneath that was shinier and more vibrant than the original factory finish had ever been. The metal seemed to be regenerating, taking on a lustrous quality that pulsed gently like living tissue. Where the chemical bath had done its work, my truck's surface looked organic, almost biological, as though the steel and aluminum were transforming into something that was no longer quite mechanical. The brushes that descended from the ceiling moved with a coordination that seemed too intelligent for automated equipment. They caressed every curve and angle of my truck with what could only be described as tenderness, lingering over certain areas and returning to spots they had already cleaned as though they were savoring the process. The sound they made was becoming increasingly disturbing, a soft whiskey noise that reminded me of the way a cat's tongue feels when it licks your hand, rough and warm and unnaturally intimate. I tried to start my engine, thinking I could simply drive out of the bay, but the ignition wouldn't turn over. The electrical system seemed to be affected by whatever process was happening outside, and even the CB radio had gone completely silent. The only sound was the continued whisper of brushes against what I had thought was metal, but was beginning to suspect might be something else entirely. Through the windshield, I could see the attendants standing at the entrance to the bay, their too bright smile visible even at this distance, their hands pressed together in an attitude that looked almost prayerful. The transformation of my truck was accelerating now, and I could feel vibrations through the seat that had nothing to do with the engine. The steering wheel under my hands was growing warm, and the plastic surfaces of the dashboard were taking on a suppleness that made me snatch my fingers away in revulsion. Whatever was happening to the outside of my vehicle was beginning to affect the interior as well, and the thought of being trapped inside something that was no longer quite a truck filled me with a panic that cut through my earlier drowsiness like a blade. I grabbed the door handle and pushed, but it wouldn't budge. The door itself seemed to have sealed against the frame, and the window that should have rolled down was fixed in place as though it had been welded shut. The washing process was entering its final phase, and the brushes were retreating toward the ceiling, but the damage had been done. My truck was no longer the familiar machine I had been driving for the past 3 years. It had become something else, something that breathed softly around me and pulsed with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the process stopped. The brushes retracted completely, the flow of chemical solution ceased, and the bay fell silent except for the gentle dripping of excess liquid into the drains. My engine turned over immediately when I tried the ignition, rumbling to life with a smoothness it hung. When the road reached for heaven. From Marcus. The first thing I noticed wasn't the tire tracks themselves, but the way the asphalt seemed to shimmer where they ended, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, except it was 3 a.m. and snow was falling thick as cotton through my headlight beams. I'd been driving this stretch of Interstate 80 through Wyoming for the better part of 15 years, hauling everything from lumber to livestock across the empty spaces between forgotten towns, and I thought I knew every curve, every pothole, every trick the road could play on a tired driver's eyes. But I'd never seen tire tracks that started normal as any other and then just lifted right off the ground, continuing upward into the dark sky above, like some invisible highway had opened up through the clouds. My rig, a midnight blue Peterbilt 379 that I'd named Sarah after my late wife, hummed steady and reassuring beneath me as I slowed to get a better look. The CB radio crackled with empty static, and I reached over to adjust the squelch, hoping to catch another driver's voice in the electronic wilderness. Nothing but white noise and the distant whisper of atmospheric interference that always seemed louder on nights like this, when the world felt too big and too empty and too strange for comfort. The heater blew warm air across my boots, but a chill was already settling into my bones, the kind that comes not from cold, but from seeing something that shouldn't exist. I pulled Sarah over onto the shoulder, her air brakes hissing like a sigh of relief, and stepped down into the snow. The flakes were fat and lazy, drifting more than falling, and they caught the red and amber glow of my running lights like tiny lanterns. My boots crunched against the gravel and ice as I walked back toward the spot where I'd seen the tracks, my breath forming clouds that hung in the still air before dissolving into nothing. The highway stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of black cutting through the endless white of the Wyoming plains, and for a moment I felt completely alone in the world, just me and the snow and whatever strange thing waited to be discovered. The tire tracks were definitely real, pressed deep into the slush and snow that had accumulated on the road's surface. They looked fresh, maybe an hour old at most, and they belonged to a big truck, something with dual rear wheels and enough weight to leave deep impressions even through the accumulating precipitation. I followed them with my flashlight beam, watching as they approached from the east, ran straight down the center line for maybe 50 yards, and then began to angle upward, still perfectly formed, still clearly defined, rising into the air at what looked like a 15-degree incline. At about 20 feet high, they faded into the darkness above, but I could swear I saw them continuing, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely into the low-hanging clouds. My hands were shaking as I lit a cigarette, and it wasn't from the cold. I'd heard stories from other drivers over the years, tales told in truck stop coffee shops and over CB radios during the long, lonely hours between sunset and dawn. Stories about phantom trucks that appeared in rear-view mirrors and vanished when you turned to look directly at them. About ghostly headlights that followed you for miles through empty desert before winking out like candles in the wind. About voices on the radio calling for help from coordinates that led to nothing but abandoned road and scrub brush. Most drivers laughed off such tales as the products of too much caffeine, too little sleep, and too many hours spent watching the hypnotic flow of white lines beneath their wheels. But standing there, in the falling snow, looking up at tire tracks that climbed toward heaven like rungs on an invisible ladder, I found myself reconsidering everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. The sound started so softly I almost missed it, beneath the whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the tick of my cooling engine. It was a low rumble, distant but unmistakable, the deep bass note of a diesel engine working hard against gravity. I looked up into the darkness, following the angle of the tracks with my eyes, and saw nothing but snow and clouds, and the faint glow of starlight filtered through the overcast sky. But the sound was growing louder, closer, and it seemed to be coming from directly above me, as if somewhere in that invisible highway 20 or 30 feet over my head, another truck was making its way through the night. I backed away from the tracks, my cigarette forgotten and smoldering in the snow at my feet, and craned my neck to peer up into the swirling darkness. The engine noise was clearer now, accompanied by the whisper of tires against pavement that shouldn't exist, and I could have sworn I heard the faint squeak of suspension springs and the distant rattle of cargo shifting in a trailer. It was the sound of a working truck, a real truck, carrying real freight along a real road that just happened to be floating in the sky above the Wyoming interstate, like some fever dream born of too many miles and too much solitude. That's when I saw the lights. They appeared gradually, like stars emerging from behind clouds, except they were moving, and they were red and amber and white, in all the right configurations for a tractor-trailer, running with full lighting. First the marker lights on top of the cab, then the headlights cutting twin beams through the falling snow, then the clearance lights outlining the shape of a long trailer. The whole rig materialized out of the darkness above me, running along that impossible skyward highway with all the casual normalcy of any other truck on any other night. Except it was 30 feet in the air and defying every law of physics I'd ever learned. I could see it clearly now. A red Kenworth with a white trailer running at highway speed along its elevated roadway. The driver's cab was lit from within, and I caught a glimpse of a figure behind the wheel. Just a shadow, really, hunched over the steering wheel with the focused concentration of someone who'd been driving through the night for hours. As the phantom truck passed overhead, I heard its engine downshift, heard the brief chirp of air brakes, heard the familiar sounds of a driver making the small adjustments that keep a heavy load tracking straight and true down an endless highway. For a moment, our paths intersected in the strangest way imaginable. I was standing on solid ground, looking up, while somewhere in the sky above me another driver was looking down at his own version of the road, following his own set of tracks, hauling his own cargo toward whatever destination waited at the end of his ethereal interstate. I wondered if he could see me, wondered if my truck looked as strange to him as his looked to me, wondered if we were both equally real or equally phantom in whatever cosmic joke had brought us together in this moment. The sky truck disappeared into the western darkness, its lights fading gradually until they were indistinguishable from the stars, its engine noise dopplering away to nothing more than a whisper carried on the wind. I stood alone, again in the falling snow, surrounded by the familiar reality of asphalt and sagebrush and the distant glow of my own rig's running lights. But the tracks were still there in the snow, still angling upward into empty air, still defying explanation or belief. I walked back to Sarah with legs that felt unsteady beneath me, climbed into her familiar cab, and sat for a long moment, with my hands on the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The CB radio crackled with static, and on impulse I keyed the microphone and called out into the electronic darkness. Breaker 19, this is the Blue Sarah running westbound on I-80 near mile marker 215. Anyone out there? Copy. Nothing but static answered me, the same white noise that had been my only companion when I'd first spotted the impossible tracks. I put Sarah in gear and pulled back onto the highway, her engine settling into the steady rhythm that had carried me across 1,000,000 miles of American road. In my mirrors, I could see the tire tracks receding behind me, still visible in the red glow of my taillights, still angling upward into the night sky like a question mark written in snow and asphalt. I drove for another hour before I found a truck stop, parked under the fluorescent glare of overhead lights, and sat in the driver's lounge with a cup of coffee that had been brewing since afternoon, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a trick of light and shadow and exhaustion. But sometimes, on nights when the sky is overcast and the snow is falling just right, I find myself looking up through my windshield, scanning the darkness above the highway for the glow of phantom lights. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see them up there, following their own invisible road through the clouds, carrying loads that were never meant for earthbound destinations. The tracks are still there too, or others just like them, pressed into fresh snow on empty stretches of highway where the world grows thin and strange things become possible. I've never stopped to examine them again, but I slow down when I pass and I listen carefully to the sounds my engine makes, wondering if somewhere above me another driver is doing the same. The cargo that breathes. From Marcus Chen. The dispatch call came through at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, crackling over the CB with that familiar static that always made me think of distant thunderstorms. I was parked at the pilot station just outside Bakersfield, nursing my third cup of coffee and watching the neon sign flicker against the fog rolling in from the valley. 23 years hauling freight up and down the Pacific coast, and I thought I'd seen every kind of cargo there was to move. Temperature-controlled pharmaceuticals, livestock, even a circus once with tigers that paced their cages the entire 800-mile journey. But this pickup was different from the moment I got the call. The dispatcher's voice sounded strained, like she was reading from a script someone had shoved in front of her at the last minute. Medical equipment, she said. Urgent delivery from a research facility outside Fresno to a hospital in Portland. Time-sensitive biological samples that required constant climate control and minimal vibration during transport. The pay was triple my usual rate, which should have been my first warning, but the mortgage on my rig was coming due, and my daughter's college tuition wasn't getting any cheaper. I fired up my Kenworth and pulled out into the night, the familiar rumble of the Cummins engine settling into its steady rhythm as I headed north toward the pickup location. The facility was tucked away in the foothills, accessible only by a winding two-lane road that snaked between vineyards and abandoned farm equipment. My headlights cut through patches of ground fog that seemed to move with a life of their own, swirling across the asphalt like ghostly fingers, reaching for the warmth of my engine. The research complex was smaller than I'd expected, just a cluster of low concrete buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Security lights bathed the loading dock in harsh white light that made everything look bleached and lifeless. A man in a lab coat was waiting for me, clipboard in hand, checking his watch every few seconds like he was timing something critical. His name tag read Dr. Handley, and when he shook my hand, his palm was damp with nervous sweat, despite the cool night air. The trailer they wanted me to haul was already loaded and sealed, a standard refrigerated unit that hummed with the quiet efficiency of its cooling system. Dr. Henley walked me around the trailer, pointing out the temperature monitoring equipment and explaining the importance of maintaining exactly 34 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the journey. Any deviation above 36 degrees or below 32, he said, and the samples would be compromised. He handed me a sealed envelope with the delivery instructions and a phone number to call if anything went wrong. As I was completing the pre-trip inspection, running my hands along the trailer's tires and checking the brake lines, I heard it for the first time. A sound that seemed to come from inside the trailer itself. Soft and wet and distinctly organic. It lasted only a few seconds, barely audible over the hum of the refrigeration unit, but it stopped me cold. I pressed my ear against the trailer's aluminum siding and listened, but heard only the steady mechanical breathing of the cooling system. Dr. Hanley was suddenly beside me, his face pale in the security lights. "Is everything all right?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested he knew exactly what I'd heard. I asked him about the sound, describing it as best I could, but he just shook his head and muttered something about the cooling system making unusual noises when it cycled. He assured me it was nothing to worry about, just the equipment adjusting to maintain proper temperature. I climbed into my cab and started the journey north, taking Highway 99 through the Central Valley. The fog was getting thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards ahead of my front bumper. The radio played softly in the background, late-night talk shows discussing topics that seemed to drift in and out of coherence like the fog itself. Every now and then, static would overwhelm the signal, filling the cab with white noise that reminded me of breathing. About an hour into the drive, somewhere between Modesto and Stockton, I heard it again. That same wet, rhythmic sound, but louder this time, unmistakably coming from the trailer behind me. I could feel it through the seat of my truck, a subtle vibration that seemed to match the rhythm of the sound. I pulled onto the shoulder and engaged the parking brake, then walked back to inspect the trailer once more. The refrigeration unit was running normally, displaying a steady 34 degrees on its digital readout. But when I placed my hand flat against the trailer's side, I could feel something that made my skin crawl. A pulsing, like a massive heartbeat, slow and deliberate, and impossibly strong. The trailer's aluminum walls seemed to expand and contract slightly with each pulse, as if something inside was breathing with the kind of deep, measured breaths you might hear in a hospital room. I called the number Dr. Henley had given me, but it went straight to voicemail. His recorded message was brief and professional, instructing me to continue with the delivery as planned and to contact him only in case of emergency. I tried calling dispatch, but got only static on every channel. The fog had grown so thick that I could barely see the yellow lines on the highway, and other traffic had all but disappeared. As I continued north, the sounds from the trailer became more frequent and more distinct. What had started as occasional coughing or breathing sounds evolved into something that sounded almost like voices, muffled and distorted, but unmistakably human in their cadence. I convinced myself it was just the cooling system, creating acoustic illusions, the way pipes in an old house can sound like footsteps or voices in the night. But deep down, I knew I was trying to rationalize something that couldn't be explained away. Near Sacramento, I stopped at an all-night truck stop to refuel and check on the trailer again. The place was nearly deserted, just a handful of other drivers catching a few hours of sleep in their cabs. The fluorescent lights in the parking area buzzed and flickered, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. As I walked around my trailer, checking the tires and inspecting the refrigeration unit, the sounds from inside grew more agitated, more urgent. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A voice, clear and distinct, calling my name from inside the sealed trailer. "Marcus," it said, drawn out and pleading, like someone in terrible pain. "Marcus, help us." I stepped back from the trailer, my heart hammering against my ribs, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. But the voice came again, joined by others, a chorus of voices calling out in what sounded like desperation or terror. I ran back to my cab and grabbed my phone, trying once more to reach Dr. Henley, or dispatch or anyone who could explain what was happening. But every call went dead, every radio channel filled with static that sounded increasingly like whispered conversations in languages I couldn't identify. The fog had grown so dense that it seemed to press against my windshield like something solid, and the temperature gauge on my dashboard showed the outside air had dropped to near freezing. The rest of the journey became a nightmare of endless highway stretching through fog so thick it seemed to swallow my headlights. The voices from the trailer grew more frequent and more coherent, sometimes calling my name, sometimes pleading for help, sometimes just sobbing with a heartbreak so profound it made me want to pull over and weep. But I kept driving, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, focusing on the yellow lines that appeared and disappeared in my headlights like breadcrumbs leading through a dark forest. Dawn was breaking as I finally reached the hospital in Portland, though the fog remained so thick that the sunrise was just a pale glow diffused through gray cotton. The loading dock was staffed by medical personnel who seemed to be expecting me, their faces hidden behind surgical masks and protective gear. They unloaded the trailer with practiced efficiency, transferring its contents to a secure area of the hospital that required multiple key cards and biometric scanners to access. As they wheeled the last container into the building, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a person's face pressed against the glass viewing panel, eyes wide and mouth open as if screaming. But the attendant quickly covered it with a sheet, and I was left wondering if exhaustion and stress had finally gotten the better of my imagination. The paperwork was signed, the delivery confirmed, and I was paid in cash with a bonus that was more than I typically made in 3 months. But as I drove my empty trailer away from the hospital, I realized the sounds hadn't stopped. They were still there, faint but persistent. That rhythmic breathing and occasional cough, as if something had been left behind in my trailer's empty cargo space. I've been driving empty trailers ever since, but I still hear them sometimes on long night runs when the fog rolls in and the radio fills with static. Those voices, calling my name, asking for help that I can never give, reminding me that some cargo is meant to stay where the spiral down. From Marcus Rivera. The GPS had been acting strange for the last 100 miles, flickering between satellite signals as I guided my Peterbilt through the rolling hills of central Oregon. 23 years of long-haul trucking had taught me to trust my instincts over technology, but tonight the familiar weight of exhaustion pressed against my eyelids like lead curtains. I needed fuel, food, and maybe a few hours of rest before pushing on to Portland with my load of furniture destined for a warehouse that opened at 6 a.m. sharp. The exit sign materialized through the steady curtain of October rain, its reflective surface catching my headlights with an almost phosphorescent glow. Exit 247, services available, the simple black letters promised against their green background. I'd driven this stretch of Interstate 84 countless times over the years, but somehow this particular exit didn't spark any recognition in my memory. Perhaps it was new construction, one of those rural truck stops that seemed to appear overnight to serve the endless stream of commerce flowing across America's arteries. My turn signal clicked with metronomic precision as I eased the 18-wheeler toward the off-ramp, feeling the familiar slight pull as we left the highway's main flow. The exit curved gently to the right, a smooth arc of wet asphalt that reflected my headlights in wavering streams. Rain drummed against the windshield with increasing intensity, and I adjusted the wipers to a faster rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. The curve continued longer than I had expected, sweeping around in what felt like an unusually wide arc for a simple highway exit. Through the rain-streaked passenger window, I caught glimpses of darkened forest pressing close to the roadway, tall Douglas firs standing like silent sentinels in the night. No lights penetrated that wall of timber, no sign of the truck stop or gas station that the highway sign had promised. The curve kept turning, banking slightly as if it were part of some elaborate highway interchange, though I couldn't recall seeing any indication of multiple routes when I'd committed to the exit. My CB radio crackled with distant static, picking up fragments of conversations from truckers somewhere out in the night. The voices seemed strangely distorted, as if filtered through layers of atmospheric interference, their words stretching and compressing like audio played at the wrong speed. I reached for the handset to call out my location and ask about services at this exit, but the static grew so intense that I returned it to its cradle and focused on the road ahead. The exit ramp continued its gentle rightward curve, and I began to feel the first stirrings of unease in my chest. In my decades of driving, I'd never encountered an off-ramp that curved for so long without revealing its destination. Most exits were straightforward affairs, brief transitions from highway to surface street, designed for efficiency rather than scenic beauty. This felt different, almost leisurely in its approach, as if the engineers had decided to create a spiral descent through the forested hills. My fuel gauge showed just over a quarter tank, enough to reach Portland under normal circumstances, but the uncertainty of this situation made me conscious of every gallon. The engine's steady diesel rumble provided a comforting constant beneath the rain's percussion, 18 cylinders working in harmony to pull 40 tons through the curving night. I downshifted slightly as the curve seemed to tighten, feeling the Jake brake's familiar resistance as we maintained a safe speed on the wet pavement. Through breaks in the forest canopy, I caught occasional glimpses of distant lights, tiny pinpricks that might have been farmhouses or other travelers on some parallel roadway. They appeared and vanished so quickly that I began to question whether I'd seen them at all, or if they were simply reflections of my own headlights bouncing off low-hanging clouds or patches of fog drifting between the trees. The curve began to feel familiar in an unsettling way, as if I'd driven this exact section of road before tonight. A particular grouping of 3 dead trees on the inside of the curve seemed to trigger a memory I couldn't quite place, their pale branches reaching toward the sky like desperate fingers. I found myself anticipating the next bend, the next slight dip in the roadway, with an accuracy that made no rational sense, given that I'd never taken this exit before. My watch showed 12:43 a.m. when I began to suspect something was genuinely wrong. I'd been on this curving exit ramp for nearly 20 minutes, far longer than any normal highway transition should require. The curve continued with patient persistence, neither tightening into a proper spiral nor straightening toward a destination. It simply curved, endlessly right, through the dark forest that pressed against both sides of the roadway like walls of a living tunnel. I tried the CB radio again, fighting through the static to reach someone, anyone who might explain what I was experiencing. The handset felt cold and somehow slippery in my grip, as if condensation had formed on its surface despite the cab's warmth. When I managed to break through the interference and call out my situation, my own voice came back to me through the speaker, delayed by several seconds and pitched slightly lower, as if it had traveled a great distance before returning. The fuel gauge now showed less than a quarter tank, though I was certain it had read exactly that level when I'd first noticed it. Either the gauge was malfunctioning, or I'd been driving this curve far longer than my watch indicated. Time itself seemed to be playing tricks, stretching and compressing like the distorted voices on the CB radio. I began to count the seconds between my heartbeats, trying to establish some reliable measure of duration, but even that internal rhythm felt uncertain and variable. A new sound joined the rain and diesel rumble, a low harmonious note that seemed to emanate from the roadway itself. At first I attributed it to wind through the forest, but the tone remained constant despite the intermittent gusts that rocked the trailer. It was almost musical, a sustained note that seemed to match the curve's radius, as if the pavement were a vast string being bowed by my tire's passage. The dead trees appeared again on the inside curve exactly as before, their pale branches arranged in the same desperate, reaching gesture. This time I was certain I'd seen them before, not just tonight, but in this exact configuration, at this precise angle of approach. I was traveling in a loop, following an exit ramp that curved back upon itself in some impossible geometric configuration that defied the laws of basic road construction. Panic began to build in my chest like pressure in a boiler, but I forced myself to maintain steady breathing and steady speed. In 23 years of trucking, I'd learned that panic was the enemy of problem solving, that even the strangest situations usually had logical explanations once examined with clear thinking. Perhaps this was some kind of elaborate circular interchange designed to allow traffic to reverse direction or merge with multiple highways. Such things existed in major metropolitan areas, complex knots of elevated concrete that could confuse even experienced drivers. But the forest pressing against the roadway suggested this was anything but a metropolitan interchange, and the complete absence of other traffic or exit options argued against any conventional explanation. I was alone on a curve that led nowhere but back to itself, burning fuel and time in an endless spiral through the Oregon hills. My speedometer showed a steady 45 miles per hour, a reasonable speed for an exit ramp in wet conditions. If I'd been maintaining that speed for the time indicated by my watch, I should have traveled nearly 20 miles by now, far enough to cross several counties in this part of Oregon. Yet the forest looked identical to when I'd first left the interstate. The same dense stands of Douglas fir, the same occasional clearings where something undefined reflected my headlight. The CB radio suddenly burst into clear reception, carrying a conversation between two drivers discussing weather conditions along Interstate 84. Their voices were sharp and immediate, cutting through the static that had plagued the receiver since I'd entered this loop. I grabbed the handset and called out to them, describing my situation and asking for guidance back to the main highway. Baker 19, this is Iron Horse eastbound at mile marker 251, looking for any driver who might know about exit 247. I seem to be caught in some kind of loop here and could use directions back to the interstate. The response came immediately, but it was my own voice again, repeating my exact words with that same slight delay and lower pitch. Behind my voice I could hear the sound of my own diesel engine, the same rhythm of my windshield wipers, even the rain striking glass with identical intensity. Somewhere out in the night, another version of myself was driving another truck through another identical curve, calling out the same plea for help. I released the handset and let it fall to the end of its coiled cord, where it swayed gently with the truck's motion through the curve. The harmonious note from the roadway seemed to grow stronger, joined now by other tones that suggested multiple vehicles traveling multiple loops, each adding their own frequency to a growing chord of impossible geometry. The fuel gauge showed 1/8 of a tank when I finally saw the solution, or what I hoped was a solution. Far ahead, barely visible through the rain and darkness, a break appeared in the forest wall, on the outside of the curve. Not an official exit, the weight that never lifts. From Marcus Sullivan. The thing about driving a 48-foot flatbed for 23 years is that you learn to feel every pound of cargo through the seat of your pants. The way the trailer pulls when you're loaded heavy with steel coils, how the suspension settles when you're carrying machinery, even the subtle shift in the engine's rhythm when you're hauling something that throws off the weight distribution. So when I picked up that emergency load of construction equipment outside Bakersfield on a fog-thick Tuesday night in November, I knew something was wrong before I'd even cleared the yard. The trailer felt heavier than the manifest said it should. Not dramatically so, but enough that my Peterbilt's diesel was working harder than usual as we climbed the grades heading north on Interstate 5. The load was simple enough. A small excavator, some concrete forms and miscellaneous tools bound for a job site in Reading. Standard strapping, everything properly secured according to DOT regulations. The shipper had been eager to get the freight moving, explaining that the construction crew needed the equipment first thing Wednesday morning to meet some critical deadline. I'd agreed to the run despite the late hour because the rate was generous and the fog that had rolled in from the Pacific would likely burn off by dawn, making for decent driving conditions through the Central Valley. The shipper's yard had been nearly deserted when I'd arrived. Just a single forklift operator loading my trailer under the pale yellow glow of sodium vapor lights that turned the thick fog into an amber curtain around us. The man had worked quickly and silently, declining my offers to help inspect the tie-downs, waving me off when I'd suggested we double-check the weight distribution. Now, 2 hours into the run, that extra weight had become a constant presence in my awareness. The way my tractor's front end felt slightly light on the steering, how the trailer brakes grabbed a fraction harder than they should when I'd tested them coming down the grapevine. It wasn't dangerous. I've hauled plenty of loads that push the legal limits, but it nagged at me like a half-remembered song playing at the edge of consciousness. The fog had thickened as I'd climbed elevation, reducing visibility to maybe 30 yards ahead of my headlights. Other traffic was sparse at this hour, just the occasional set of taillights materializing out of the murk like red stars being born from gray nothing. I'd settled into that meditative rhythm that comes with night driving, the steady thrum of the diesel engine mixing with the whisper of air through the cab's ventilation system, and the barely audible hiss of my CB radio scanning empty channels. That's when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the familiar symphony of highway travel, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from beneath the trailer. Not the sharp metallic ping of a loose strap, or the scraping of something dragging on the asphalt, but something more organic. Something that matched the cadence of my heartbeat when I held my breath to listen more carefully. I told myself it was probably just the excavator shifting slightly on its mounts as the trailer flexed over the road's minor imperfections. Heavy machinery can develop a kind of harmonic vibration during transport, creating sounds that seem almost musical in their regularity. But as the miles rolled by and the tapping continued, I found myself pressing my ear closer to the driver's side window, trying to isolate the source of the noise. When I reached the truck stop in Kolinga, I decided to take a break and walk the load. It's good practice anyway, checking tie-downs, looking for any signs of cargo shift, making sure nothing has worked loose that might create problems down the road. The parking area was nearly empty, just a couple of other trucks positioned far enough apart that their idling engines created separate islands of diesel rumble in the fog-muffled silence. I grabbed my flashlight from behind the seat and climbed down, my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the rear of my trailer. The fog was so thick here that the truck stop's neon signs were just vague, colorful halos floating in the darkness, and I could barely make out the silhouette of my own equipment 12 feet away. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and damp earth, with an underlying sweetness that might have been night-blooming jasmine from the fields beyond the truck stop's perimeter. The excavator was exactly where it should be, properly chained and blocked according to regulations. The concrete forms were still neatly stacked and strapped tight. I ran my flashlight beam along every chain, every strap, every contact point where the cargo met the trailer deck. Everything looked perfect, textbook secure, exactly the way it should for a routine haul. But when I crouched down to check the underside clearances, my flashlight beam caught something that made my pulse quicken. There, in the narrow space between the trailer's rear axles, hanging from the undercarriage like some kind of bizarre automotive stalactite, was what looked like a bundle of old clothing. Dark fabric that might once have been blue or black, wrapped around something roughly the size and shape of a child's sleeping bag. It swayed ever so slightly as I watched, despite the complete absence of any wind in the fog-still air. I called out a hello, thinking maybe some transient had crawled under my trailer for shelter while I'd been inside the truck stop, but got no response. The bundle just continued its gentle pendulum motion, suspended from the trailer's frame by what appeared to be several bungee cords or elastic strap. As I moved closer, playing my flashlight beam across the mysterious cargo, I could see that whatever was inside the bundle was dense enough to pull the fabric taut, creating a distinctly human outline. The rational part of my mind immediately began calculating explanations, Someone at the shipping yard had probably secured some additional equipment under the trailer, maybe a bag of tools or spare parts that hadn't fit on the deck with the main cargo. It would explain the extra weight I'd been sensing, and the tapping sound could be the bundle bumping against the trailer's cross members as we'd traveled over the highway's expansion joints and minor road irregularities. But as I knelt there in the gravel, studying this unexpected addition to my load, I noticed something that sent a chill through my chest despite the warm November air. The bundle was positioned directly beneath the trailer's center of gravity, in precisely the spot where adding weight would have the most subtle but noticeable effect on the truck's handling characteristics. It was tied to the frame with a sophisticated arrangement of straps and cables that looked far too professional, far too deliberate, to be the work of someone simply securing a forgotten tool bag. I reached under the trailer with my flashlight, trying to get a better angle on the bundle's attachment points, when the tapping sound returned. Not the random bumping I'd assumed, but a deliberate pattern. 3 quick taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. It was coming from inside the bundle itself, as if something trapped within was trying to communicate. My first instinct was to cut the thing loose immediately, but 23 years of professional driving had taught me the importance of thinking before acting when dealing with unknown cargo. If this was some kind of legitimate shipment that hadn't been properly documented, removing it could create liability issues. If it was something more sinister, contraband or worse, getting involved might put me in legal jeopardy. The smart move was to call my dispatcher, report the situation, and let company policy dictate the next steps. But as I backed away from the trailer, intending to return to my cab and make that call, the tapping pattern changed. 3 quick taps, then 2, then 1, then a longer pause, followed by a sound that raised the hair on my neck. A soft, muffled voice that might have been calling for help. I've heard plenty of strange sounds during my years on the road. Wind through trailer doors that sounds like crying, tire noise that mimics human voices, the groaning of cargo that can seem almost like conversation in the lonely hours before dawn. But this was different. This was unmistakably human, unmistakably distressed, and coming from directly beneath my trailer. I dropped to my knees without hesitation, crawling under the trailer deck with my flashlight gripped in my teeth, reaching for the nearest strap that held the bundle in place. The voice came again, clearer now, definitely a child's voice, saying something I couldn't quite understand. My fingers fumbled with the strap's release mechanism, a complex cam buckle that required precise manipulation to open safely. As the first strap came loose, the bundle shifted slightly, rotating on its remaining attachment points, and in the shifting beam of my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a pale human hand, pressed against the dark fabric from within. Small fingers, child-sized, moving weakly against their cloth prison. I worked faster on the remaining straps, my heart hammering as I realized I was probably looking at a kidnapping situation. Some monster's helpless victim being transported like cargo to God knows what fate. The fog seemed to press closer around us, muffling even the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. The mark of cold fingers. From Jake Morrison. The thing about driving the overnight hauls between Denver and Salt Lake City is that you get used to the emptiness, the way the mountains swallow up the world and leave you suspended between earth and sky, with nothing but the steady thrum of your diesel engine for company. I've been running this route for 15 years now, and my Kenworth T680 knows these roads better than I know the lines on my own face. The GPS is just decoration at this point, a glowing rectangle that tells me what I already feel in my bones about every curve, every grade, every rest stop between here and there. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I picked up the hitchhiker just outside of Vail Pass. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow was starting to dust the asphalt, catching in my headlights like tiny stars falling to earth. I wasn't planning to stop for anyone. Never do, really. But something about the figure standing beside the guardrail made me ease off the accelerator and bring the rig to a slow halt on the shoulder. He looked ordinary enough in my mirrors, just a man in a dark jacket with his thumb out, no luggage that I could see. When I rolled down the passenger window, the cold air rushed in with the scent of pine and approaching winter. He climbed up into the cab without saying much, just a quiet thank you, and something about needing to get to Grand Junction. His voice was soft, almost whispered, and when he settled into the passenger seat, I noticed he kept his hands tucked deep in his jacket pockets. The first hour passed in comfortable silence. He stared out the window at the passing landscape, the snow-covered peaks that jutted up like broken teeth against the star-filled sky, while I focused on keeping the big rig steady on the increasingly slick roads. The heater was running full blast, but somehow the cab still felt cold, as if winter had followed him inside and settled into the spaces between us. It wasn't until we were descending into the valley near Glenwood Springs that I started to notice the small things that weren't quite right. My passenger never moved his hands, never reached for the door handle or adjusted his seatbelt, or did any of the unconscious gestures that people make during a long ride. He just sat there, perfectly still, with his breath misting slightly in the air despite the heater's efforts. When I tried to make conversation about the weather or the road conditions, he would nod or give brief, nearly inaudible responses, but his eyes never left the window. The radio had been crackling with static for the past 20 minutes, picking up fragments of distant stations that faded in and out like voices from another world. Country music from Colorado Springs mixed with talk radio from Salt Lake City, creating an eerie soundtrack to our journey through the darkness. I reached over to adjust the tuning, and that's when I saw it for the first time. On the passenger side window, pressed against the glass from the inside, was the clear outline of a handprint. The condensation around it showed every detail, every line and whorl of the palm and fingers. But what made my stomach drop was that the print appeared to be made by a hand much larger than any normal person's, and it was frosted with ice crystals as if it had been there for hours in sub-no temperatures. I glanced over at my passenger, but his hands were still buried in his jacket pockets and he showed no sign of having touched the window. The print faced inward, as if someone outside the truck had pressed their palm against the glass with tremendous force. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe the long hours and the hypnotic rhythm of the road were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, the handprint was still there, now accompanied by 4 parallel lines that looked like finger marks dragged slowly downward. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed that the heater was working perfectly, but I found myself shivering as we passed through the long tunnel carved into the mountainside. The overhead lights strobed past us in a steady rhythm, and in each brief moment of illumination I could see my passenger's profile, pale and sharp-featured, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. His breath continued to mist in the air, small puffs that seemed too regular, too measured, like he was breathing by conscious effort rather than instinct. We emerged from the tunnel into a landscape transformed by the steadily falling snow. The world had become monochromatic, all blacks and grays and whites, with my headlights carving a narrow corridor through the swirling flakes. The highway stretched ahead of us like a ribbon of darkness, and I realized that we hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour. It was as if we were the only 2 people left in the world, traveling through a winter wasteland that existed outside of normal time and space. That's when I noticed the handprints multiplying. On the passenger window, on the windshield, on the side mirror, perfect impressions appeared and disappeared, like invisible hands were exploring every surface of the cab. Some were small, child-size, while others were enormous, with fingers that seemed too long and joints that bent in ways that human joints shouldn't. The frost that outlined each print glittered in the dashboard lights, creating a constellation of impossible touches. My passenger finally spoke, his voice barely audible above the engine noise and the whisper of snow against the windshield. He said something about being cold, so very cold and needing to warm his hands. When I glanced over at him, I saw that his jacket was now hanging open, revealing a thin shirt underneath, but his hands were still not visible. The temperature in the cab seemed to drop another 10 degrees, and I could see my own breath now, mixing with his in the air between us. The radio suddenly tuned itself to a clear signal, an old country song about highways and lonesome travelers and the ghosts that ride the roads at night. The singer's voice was mournful and distant, as if it were coming from somewhere far away in both space and time. My passenger turned toward me for the first time since he'd gotten in the truck, and I caught a glimpse of his eyes in the dashboard light. They were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, like looking into deep water at midnight. More handprints appeared on the windows, now accompanied by what looked like faces pressed against the glass from impossible angles. The condensation showed the outline of cheeks and foreheads and lips, all of them turned toward the inside of the cab, as if a crowd of invisible people were trying to look in at us. The prints and faces appeared faster now, overlapping each other in a chaotic pattern that made the entire cab feel like it was surrounded by a crowd of desperate, reaching spirits. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach the next town, the next truck stop, anywhere with lights and people and warmth. The speedometer climbed past the safe limit for the icy roads, but I didn't care. Something was fundamentally wrong with my passenger, with the handprints, with the whole situation, and every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of long-haul driving was screaming at me to get away from whatever had climbed into my truck outside of Vale Pass. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that stuck to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them away. Through the white curtain I could barely make out the road ahead, but I kept pushing forward, following the yellow lines that disappeared and reappeared in the swirling chaos. The handprints on the windows had become so numerous that they overlapped like scales, and the glass was fogging over despite the heater's efforts, as if the temperature inside the cab was dropping toward absolute zero. My passenger reached into his jacket pocket, finally moving his hands after hours of perfect stillness. What he pulled out wasn't what I expected. It was an old photograph, black and white and creased with age, showing a man standing beside a truck that looked exactly like mine. The man in the photograph had my face, my build, my way of standing, with one hand on the door handle, but the picture had clearly been taken decades before I was born. He held it out toward me, and I could see that his fingers were blue-white with cold. And when he pressed the photo against the dashboard, it left a perfect handprint in frost. That's when I understood. The handprints weren't being made by invisible people outside the truck. They were being made by people who had been inside the truck. Passengers who had ridden in that seat before, all of them leaving their mark on the glass and metal and plastic surfaces. The cold that followed him wasn't winter cold. It was the cold of the space between spaces, the temperature of the road that exists parallel to the one we drive on, where all the hitchhikers who never reach their destinations continue their eternal journey. I saw the lights of Grand Junction ahead of us, warm and yellow and beautifully normal, and I pushed the truck toward them like a man swimming toward the surface of a deep lake. The handprints were fading now, the faces in the condensation dissolving back into random moisture, but the cold remained, settling deep into my bones with a chill that I knew would the luminous breakdown. From Marcus Chin. The CB radio had been crackling with warnings about the stretch of Interstate 40 through eastern New Mexico for the better part of an hour, but I figured most truckers were just being superstitious about the recent string of breakdowns. My Peterbilt 379 had been running smooth as silk for 300,000 miles, and I had a tight deadline to meet in Amarillo come morning. The dashboard clock read 11:47 as I rolled past the faded welcome sign, and the desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the asphalt, broken only by the occasional cluster of sagebrush and the distant silhouette of mesas against the star-drunk sky. The engine had been purring like a contented cat all day, that familiar rumble beneath my feet providing the steady rhythm that had lulled me through countless miles over the past 15 years. I knew every vibration, every subtle shift in tone that might signal trouble brewing under the hood. The air conditioning hummed quietly, keeping the cab comfortable against the lingering heat that radiated up from the desert floor, and my headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness ahead. There wasn't another vehicle in sight, just endless ribbon of highway stretching toward the horizon where heat lightning flickered in distant clouds. It was just past midnight when I first noticed something peculiar in my peripheral vision. A faint greenish glow emanating from beneath the hood that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the engine. At first I dismissed it as a trick of the dashboard lights reflecting off the chrome, but as I leaned forward and peered through the windshield, the luminescence became more pronounced. It reminded me of the fireflies I used to chase as a boy in Missouri summers, that same ethereal green phosphorescence that would dance through the humid evening air above the cornfields. But fireflies didn't live in the New Mexico desert, and they certainly didn't take up residence under truck hoods. The glow intensified as I pressed the accelerator, climbing the long grade toward Tucumcari, and I could swear I saw tiny points of light moving beneath the metal cowling like living sparks. My temperature gauge remained steady, oil pressure normal, all systems showing green across the board. The engine continued its steady rumble without missing a beat, but that strange luminescence grew brighter with each passing mile until it began to cast an eerie green pallor across the hood and windshield. I tried to rationalize it as some kind of electrical malfunction, maybe a short in the alternator causing arcing that created the illusion of movement. But deep in my gut, I knew something wasn't right. By the time I reached the truck stop outside Tucumcari, the entire engine compartment was glowing like a paper lantern, and I could make out dozens of tiny pinpricks of light dancing beneath the hood. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a couple of semis and a lone RV, their drivers presumably catching some sleep before the morning haul. I pulled into a parking space near the maintenance bay and shut down the engine, expecting the strange illumination to fade with the dying rumble of the diesel. Instead, the light seemed to grow brighter in the sudden quiet, and I could hear a faint humming sound that reminded me of high-tension power lines on a humid day. I climbed down from the cab and approached the front of the truck with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, my boots crunching on the gravel as the desert wind whispered across the empty lot. The hood release clicked with its familiar metallic snap, and I lifted the heavy cowling to reveal the most extraordinary sight I had ever witnessed in 3 decades of driving. Hundreds of tiny creatures that looked exactly like fireflies were moving through the engine compartment, their bodies pulsing with that same ethereal green light I had seen through the windshield. They crawled across the block, nested in the air filter housing, and clustered around the radiator hoses like living Christmas lights. But these weren't ordinary insects, I realized as I leaned closer for a better look. Their bodies seemed to be made of pure light, translucent and shimmering, and they moved with a purpose that suggested intelligence rather than random insect behavior. They appeared to be feeding on something, though I couldn't determine what, and occasionally one would lift off and hover for a moment before settling back down onto the warm metal. The entire engine bay hummed with their presence, a sound like distant music played through a poor radio connection, beautiful and unsettling at the same time. I stood there mesmerized for several minutes, watching their intricate dance as they moved through the mechanical maze of belts and hoses and wiring harnesses. Part of me wanted to brush them away, to restore my truck to its normal state and get back on the road toward my delivery deadline, but another part of me was fascinated by their delicate beauty, the way they seemed to pulse in perfect synchronization like a living constellation that had somehow descended from the star-filled sky above. They didn't seem to be causing any damage, and the engine had run better than ever during the last 100 miles with them aboard. That's when I noticed the first sign of trouble brewing in their luminous ranks. Several of the creatures near the battery had begun to pulse more rapidly, their green glow shifting to an amber yellow that reminded me of warning lights on an aircraft panel. The change spread through the group like ripples on a pond, and within moments the entire engine compartment was bathed in urgent yellow light. The musical humming grew louder and more discordant, taking on an almost aggressive tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took a step backward as the creatures began to lift off from their metal perches, forming a swirling cloud that hovered above the engine block like an angry swarm. The yellow glow continued to deepen, shifting toward orange and then a deep, pulsing red that turned the empty truck stop parking lot into something from a science fiction nightmare. I could feel heat radiating from the swarm now, an unnatural warmth that had nothing to do with residual engine temperature and everything to do with whatever these creatures were becoming. Their musical humming had transformed into a sound like grinding gears mixed with electronic feedback, loud enough to wake the sleeping drivers in the other trucks. I saw a few cab lights come on as people stirred from their rest, wondering about the disturbance outside their windows. Without warning, the swarm suddenly expanded outward from the engine compartment, growing larger and more agitated with each passing second. I stumbled backward toward the cab, my heart hammering against my ribs as I realized these beautiful creatures had transformed into something decidedly hostile. The red glow was so intense now that it illuminated the entire parking lot, casting long shadows that danced and writhed across the asphalt like living things. The sound they made had become almost unbearable, a keening wail that seemed to vibrate in my bones and set my teeth on edge. I grabbed the door handle and hauled myself up into the cab, slamming the door behind me just as the swarm descended toward where I had been standing. Through the windshield, I could see them swirling around the front of the truck like a miniature tornado made of angry red light, their individual forms now indistinguishable in the chaotic mass. I turned the key and heard the engine turn over, but it caught with a rough, uneven idle that told me the creatures were interfering with something vital under the hood. The dashboard gauges flickered erratically, needles jumping back and forth as if the electrical system couldn't decide what readings to display. Other drivers had emerged from their trucks now, standing in small groups and pointing at my rig as the light show continued around the engine compartment. One of them, an older man in a worn baseball cap, started walking toward my truck with what looked like a fire extinguisher in his hands. I rolled down the window and shouted for him to stay back, that it wasn't a normal fire, but my words were lost in the otherworldly shrieking coming from the swarm. The man hesitated, perhaps finally realizing that whatever was happening defied normal explanation, and retreated to a safer distance where he stood with the other drivers like spectators at some bizarre roadside attraction. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more surreal, the swarm suddenly contracted back toward the engine compartment, their angry red glow fading to orange, and then back to the original green that had first caught my attention hours earlier. The terrible shrieking sound diminished to the musical humming I had heard when I first lifted the hood, and within moments they had settled back into their positions throughout the engine bay, as if nothing had happened. The entire episode had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like I had witnessed something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I sat in the cab for another 10 minutes, waiting for my heart rate to return to normal and watching for any sign that the creatures might become agitated again. The engine had settled back into its familiar rumble, all the gauge readings had returned to normal, and the only evidence of the bizarre encounter was the lingering scent of ozone that drifted through the open window. Eventually I climbed back down and approached the hood cautiously, half expecting the swarm to erupt again. The last frequency, from Jake Morrison. The radio had been dead for 3 days when I first heard the song, crackling through static like a voice calling from the bottom of a well. I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods from Portland down to Sacramento, running the night shift because the pay was better and the roads were clearer. My old Peterbilt CB had given up the ghost somewhere outside Eugene, leaving me with nothing but the steady thrum of diesel and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt for company. The Oregon rain had been following me south, drumming against the windshield in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, knew every truck stop and way station from Seattle to Los Angeles, but something about this particular night felt different. Maybe it was the way the fog seemed to reach across the highway like grasping fingers, or how the usual traffic had thinned to almost nothing despite it being prime shipping hours. Even the trucking frequencies on my CB scanner had gone quiet, leaving only the occasional burst of static where voices should have been. I was somewhere between Medford and the California border, navigating a stretch of mountain highway that twisted through dense forest, when the radio suddenly crackled to life. The green display flickered, showing a frequency that shouldn't have existed. Numbers that seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. Then came the voice, smooth and warm like honey over gravel, singing an old trucker's ballad I hadn't heard since my father used to play in his rig when I was just a kid riding shotgun during summer breaks. The song was 18 Wheels and 13 Nights, a forgotten tune about a driver who'd been on the road so long he'd started to lose track of time and space. The melody drifted through my cab like incense, filling the cramped space with memories of truck stop diners and sunrise over endless highways. But there was something wrong with the voice. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up even as the familiar words washed over me. The singer's tone was too perfect, too knowing, as if he could see right through the radio into my cab, watching me grip the steering wheel a little tighter with each passing verse. I reached for the radio dial, thinking maybe I'd accidentally bumped it and picked up some distant AM station, but the knob wouldn't budge under my fingers. The frequency display continued to flicker with those impossible numbers, and the voice kept singing, weaving through verses I remembered and others that seemed newly written, chronicling journeys I'd never taken but somehow recognized. The rain intensified, turning the world beyond my headlights into a shifting wall of silver, and I found myself leaning forward to peer through the darkness as if something important waited just beyond my vision. The song began to change after that, subtle at first, with the singer adding details that struck uncomfortably close to home. He sang about a driver named Jake who'd been running the same routes for 15 years, about a failed marriage and kids who barely called anymore, about the way loneliness could creep into your bones like winter cold, until even your own cab felt like foreign territory. My foot eased off the accelerator without me realizing it, the speedometer dropping as I strained to catch every word, unable to shake the feeling that this phantom DJ somehow knew my life better than I did. The highway began to feel different beneath my tires, the familiar curves and straightaways seeming to stretch longer than they should have. I passed the same mile marker 3 times, though that should have been impossible given the direction I was traveling. The digital clock on my dashboard flickered between different times, jumping forward and backward in random intervals that made my head spin. When I tried to reach for my cell phone to check the time, my hand came away empty, though I couldn't remember taking it out of its usual spot on the seat beside me. The voice on the radio grew stronger, more intimate, as if the singer had somehow moved closer to the microphone. He began to speak between songs, talking directly to the listeners out there in radio land, but his words seemed meant specifically for me. He talked about the weight of cargo that went beyond mere tonnage, about loads that drivers carried in their hearts and minds, growing heavier with each mile until even the most powerful engines struggled to pull them up the steepest grades. His laugh was warm and understanding, the kind of sound that made you want to pull over at the next truck stop and buy him a cup of coffee just to keep the conversation going. I realized I was no longer alone on the highway. Other trucks had materialized around me in the rain and fog, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber that moved in perfect formation. They maintained the same speed as my Peterbilt, keeping pace without ever seeming to gain or fall behind. And when I tried to change lanes or adjust my position, they moved with me like iron filings following a magnet. Their drivers were invisible behind rain-streaked windshields and the glare of dashboard lights, but I could feel their presence, their attention focused on something I couldn't quite comprehend. The radio DJ seemed to sense my growing unease, because his voice took on a gentler tone, almost fatherly in its reassurance. He played another song, this one about drivers who'd found their way home after years of searching empty highways for something they couldn't name. The melody was beautiful and sad, accompanied by the distant sound of air brakes and the lonely call of train horns echoing across midnight prairies. I found myself singing along to words I'd never learned, harmonizing with a voice that seemed to reach through time and space to touch something deep in my chest. The convoy of phantom trucks began to peel away, one by one, as we crested a long hill, their lights fading into the rain like dying stars. I watched them disappear in my mirrors with a mixture of relief and profound loss, as if old friends were saying goodbye without explanation. The radio DJ's voice began to fade as well, growing fainter with each word until I had to strain to hear him over the sound of my own breathing. He was saying something about rest stops and final destinations, about the difference between being lost and being exactly where you needed to be, when the transmission cut to static, and then silence. My radio display went dark, leaving me alone once again with the pulse of windshield wipers and the steady growl of the engine. But the silence felt different now, less empty and more expectant, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I drove for what felt like hours through the Nevada desert, watching the rain gradually fade to nothing and the fog lift to reveal a star-filled sky that seemed impossibly vast. The highway stretched ahead in a perfect line toward the horizon, its yellow centerline disappearing into darkness like a path to somewhere beyond the edge of the world. When I finally stopped for fuel near Reno, the attendant looked at me strangely as I climbed down from my cab. He was an older man with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too many late-night travelers, and he studied my face with the kind of attention usually reserved for accident scenes or crime reports. He asked if I was feeling all right, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost, and I almost laughed at how close to the truth that might have been. I told him about the radio and the voice and the song, but the words sounded thin and unconvincing in the harsh fluorescent light of the truck stop. The attendant listened patiently, nodding at all the right moments before telling me that truckers had been reporting similar experiences along that stretch of highway for years. Strange broadcasts that came and went without explanation, voices that seemed to know too much about the drivers listening, convoys that appeared and vanished like mirages. He said some people claimed it was the ghost of an old-time trucker who died in a wreck somewhere in the mountains, still broadcasting to keep other drivers company during the long, lonely hours before dawn. I climbed back into my cab with more questions than answers, my radio still dark and silent despite my attempts to coax it back to life. The rest of my run to Sacramento passed without incident, just miles of ordinary highway and the usual early morning traffic beginning to stir as the sun crept over the eastern mountains. But even now, weeks later, I find myself scanning the dial during those deep night hours when the world feels thin and permeable, hoping to catch another glimpse of that impossible frequency where a phantom DJ still keeps the late watch for travelers who've forgotten their way home. The Thing That Feeds on Diesel, from Jake Morrison. The CB radio crackled with static as I pulled into the Moonrise truck stop somewhere along Interstate 40 in the New Mexico desert. It was one of those places that existed in the spaces between civilization, where the neon signs buzzed weakly against an ocean of stars and the coffee tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. My Kenworth's fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and the nearest major station was still 200 miles east. Sometimes on these long hauls, you don't get to be picky about where you stop. The truck stop consisted of little more than a weathered building with a hand-painted sign, 6 fuel islands that had seen better decades, and a parking area large enough for maybe a dozen rigs. Mine was the only one there, which should have been my first warning. Even the most remote stops usually had at least 1 or 2 drivers catching some sleep or grabbing a meal. The isolation felt heavy in the desert air, pressing down like the weight of all that empty sky above. I backed up to the diesel pumps, the familiar routine bringing some comfort despite the eerie quiet. The fuel island was lit by a single flickering fluorescent that cast everything in an unsettling dance of light and shadow. As I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunched on sand that had blown across the concrete, and I noticed how the wind seemed to whisper through the gaps in the building's siding. It was the kind of sound that made you think someone was trying to get your attention, even when you knew better. Inside the building, a tired-looking attendant with deeply lined skin and silver hair pulled back in a tight braid barely looked up from his paperwork. The place smelled of stale cigarettes, old coffee, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something organic and earthy that seemed out of place. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, one of them strobing intermittently and casting strange patterns on the walls lined with dusty truck accessories and expired snack. "On 6, I told him, sliding my credit card across the counter. He nodded without speaking, his weathered fingers moving slowly across the register keys. When he handed me the receipt, his eyes met mine briefly, and I saw something there that made my skin crawl. Not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned awareness, like someone who knows a terrible secret but has given up trying to warn people about it. Back outside, I began the process of fueling up, unscrewing the cap and sliding the nozzle into the tank. The diesel flowed with its familiar gurgling sound, and I found myself relaxing slightly, despite the strange atmosphere. This was routine, normal, something I had done thousands of times across countless miles of American highway. The gauge on the pump climbed steadily while I leaned against the truck's side, listening to the desert wind and watching heat lightning flicker silently on the horizon. That's when I first heard the scratching. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the sound of the fuel pump and the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. A rhythmic scraping that seemed to be coming from somewhere beneath the truck. I assumed it was just the fuel flowing through the lines, or maybe a piece of debris caught in the undercarriage. But as I listened more carefully, the sound took on a different quality, more deliberate somehow, like something with purpose was moving down there in the shadows beneath my rig. I crouched down and peered under the truck, using my phone's flashlight to cut through the darkness. The beam revealed the usual tangle of pipes, hoses, and mechanical components, all coated with the fine layer of road dust that accumulates over thousands of miles. Everything looked normal, yet the scratching continued, seeming to move from one side of the undercarriage to the other. The sound had a wet quality to it now, like claws scraping through something damp and yielding. Standing back up, I tried to shake off the uneasiness that was settling over me like a cold fog. Long-haul driving plays tricks on your mind sometimes, especially on the overnight runs, when fatigue and isolation start to blur the lines between reality and imagination. But the scratching was getting louder, more insistent, and now it seemed to be concentrated directly beneath the fuel tank. The pump clicked off, indicating a full tank, but I found myself reluctant to complete the transaction and leave. Something about that sound held me there, a fascination mixed with dread that I couldn't quite explain. I walked slowly around the truck, listening carefully, trying to pinpoint exactly where the noise was coming from. Each step brought me closer to certainty that something was deliberately moving beneath my rig, something that had no business being there. When I knelt down again near the fuel tank, the scratching suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been, pregnant with the sense of something waiting, watching, deciding what to do next. I held my breath and aimed my phone's light directly at the area beneath the diesel tank. For a moment, I saw nothing unusual, just the familiar sight of mechanical components and shadow. Then something moved. It was quick, just a flash of movement at the edge of my light's reach, but it was definitely organic. Not a piece of debris or a mechanical part, but something alive that immediately retreated deeper into the shadows when the light hit it. My hands began to shake as I tried to follow it with the beam, and I heard my own breathing become rapid and shallow in the desert quiet. "You don't want to look too close under there, friend." I jerked upright so fast that I nearly fell backward. The attendant was standing about 10 feet away, having approached with surprising stealth for someone his age. In the flickering light of the fuel island, his face looked carved from weathered stone, and his eyes held that same resigned knowing that had unsettled me earlier. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the way my pulse was hammering in my throat. He gestured vaguely toward the underside of the truck. "Been working this stop for 37 years. Seen all kinds of things out here in the desert. Things that most folks wouldn't believe if I told them. That particular thing, it's got a fondness for diesel fuel, feeds on it somehow. Usually doesn't cause any real harm, just takes a little for itself and moves on to the next truck." The scratching resumed, louder now, and I could swear I heard a wet slurping sound accompanying it. The attendant nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Of course, sometimes it gets territorial," he continued, his voice maddeningly calm. "Sometimes it decides a particular truck is its truck, and it doesn't much like the idea of sharing. When that happens, well, drivers have been known to find themselves running out of fuel a lot more often than they should. Some of them start seeing things in their mirrors during the long night drives, and some of them just disappear altogether." I wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as the ramblings of someone who had spent too many years in isolation, but the scratching beneath my truck was growing more frantic, more aggressive. Whatever was down there seemed to be working at something with increasing desperation, and I realized with growing horror that it might be trying to access my fuel tank directly. "How do I get rid of it?" I whispered, surprised by how quickly I had accepted this impossible situation. The attendant shrugged. "Can't say for sure. Like I told you, mostly they just take a little and move on. But this one's been hanging around for a few weeks now, ever since the last big rig that came through. Driver said he heard strange sounds the whole way from Phoenix, said something was following him. He topped off his tank here and headed east, but his truck was found broken down about 50 miles up the road. Fuel tank was bone dry, but there wasn't any sign of a leak. A new sound joined the scratching, a rhythmic tapping like fingernails drumming against metal. I could feel vibrations through the soles of my boots, and when I looked down, I realized they were coming from directly beneath where I was standing. Something was down there, something large enough to make the entire truck shudder with its movements. The attendant was already walking away, heading back toward the building with that same unhurried pace. "I'd get moving if I were you," he called over his shoulder. "Sometimes distance helps. Sometimes—" I needed no further encouragement. I yanked the fuel nozzle from the tank and secured it in the pump, my hands moving with practiced efficiency despite their trembling. The sounds from beneath the truck were growing more violent, and I could hear what sounded like claws scraping against metal with enough force to leave gouges. Whatever was down there was no longer content to simply feed. It was trying to establish permanent residence. As I climbed into the cab and fired up the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror that made my blood freeze. A shape was emerging from beneath the truck, something pale and segmented that moved with the horrible fluidity of deep-sea creatures. I didn't wait to see more. I threw the last stop before dawn. From Marcus. The amber glow of my dashboard clock read 3:17 a.m. when I first spotted the rest area sign through the steady curtain of October rain. Route 17 had been particularly unforgiving that night, winding through the dense pine forests of northern Maine, like a black ribbon threaded through a needle's eye. My 18-wheeler, a reliable Kenworth that had carried me across this continent more times than I could count, hummed steadily beneath me as the wipers fought their rhythmic battle against the downpour. The coffee I had picked up in Bangor hours earlier had long since grown cold in its thermos, and my eyelids felt heavy despite the caffeine coursing through my system. The sign emerged from the darkness like a beacon, its reflective surface catching my headlights and throwing the words back at me in stark white letters against a forest green background. "Rest area 1 mile," it proclaimed, and beneath that, in smaller text that I could barely make out through the rain-streaked windshield, "Historic Way Station, Est, 1952." Something about those words sent a small chill down my spine, though I could not have explained why at the time. Perhaps it was simply the isolation of this stretch of highway, or the way the storm seemed to muffle all sounds except for the steady drum of rain against my cab and the low rumble of my diesel engine. I had been driving this route for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from lumber to electronics between the ports of Maine and the distribution centers further south. Yet I could not recall ever seeing this particular rest area before. The thought struck me as odd, considering how well I knew every truck stop, way station, and scenic overlook along this corridor. But fatigue has a way of playing tricks on memory, and I reasoned that perhaps I had simply never needed to stop at this particular location before, having always timed my runs to coincide with the larger, more commercial truck stops that dotted the interstate. As I downshifted and began to slow the massive vehicle, my headlights swept across the entrance to the rest area, illuminating a narrow access road that curved away into the trees. The pavement looked older than the main highway, its surface darker and more weathered, with small potholes that filled with rainwater and reflected my lights like dozens of watching eyes. A wooden sign, weathered and partially obscured by overgrown vegetation, stood sentinel at the entrance. I could make out fragments of text as I turned in. Words like "welcome" and "travelers," visible through the moss and lichen that had claimed much of the board's surface. The rest area itself was larger than I had expected, with space for perhaps a dozen vehicles, though mine was the only one present at this lonely hour. A single sodium vapor light cast everything in an eerie orange glow, its illumination flickering occasionally, as if struggling against the storm's electric interference. The light revealed a collection of weathered picnic tables scattered across a small lawn area, their surfaces dark with rain and age, and beyond them a small brick building that I assumed housed the restrooms, and perhaps a few vending machines. I pulled my truck into a space near the building, grateful for the opportunity to stretch my legs and clear my head before attempting the final push toward Portland. The engine's rumble faded to a gentle idle as I engaged the parking brake, and for a moment I sat in the relative quiet of my cab, listening to the rain pattering against the roof and the intermittent hiss of my air brakes settling. Through my windshield, the rest area appeared almost peaceful in its solitude, a small pocket of civilization carved from the endless wilderness that stretched in all directions. It was only when I stepped down from the cab that I began to notice the details that would, over the next hour, transform my perception of this place from refuge to something altogether more sinister. The first thing that struck me was the silence beneath the rain. Rest areas, even in the most remote locations, typically carry the sounds of the nearby highway, the distant whisper of passing traffic that serves as a constant reminder of the world beyond. But here, despite being no more than a few hundred yards from Route 17, I could hear nothing but the storm and my own footsteps on the wet pavement. The building itself appeared solid enough, constructed of red brick that had darkened with age and weather, but as I approached the entrance, I noticed that the windows were not simply dark, but appeared to have been painted black from the inside. The effect was unsettling, creating the impression of enormous, dead eyes set into the structure's facade. Above the door, a metal sign had once proclaimed the facility's hours of operation, but rust and neglect had rendered most of the text illegible, leaving only fragments like "Open Dawn" and "Dusk Till" visible beneath the failing paint. The door itself was unlocked, opening with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo in the small vestibule beyond. Inside, the familiar institutional smell of public restrooms mingled with something else, something older and mustier, like dried flowers or ancient paper. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, their tubes old enough that they cast more shadows than illumination, creating a strobing effect that made the tiled walls seem to shift and breathe. The restroom was functional, if dated, with fixtures that belonged to an earlier era and mirrors that reflected my image back in a tarnished, distorted fashion that made me appear older and more haggard than I felt. It was while washing my hands that I first noticed the photographs. They lined the wall above the sinks, dozens of small frames containing black and white images that appeared to span several decades. At first glance, they seemed to be the sort of historical documentation one might find in any roadside facility. Pictures of local landmarks, notable visitors, perhaps former employees or frequent travelers. But as I dried my hands and looked more closely, something about the images began to disturb me in a way I could not immediately articulate. Each photograph showed people, individuals or small groups, standing in what was unmistakably this very rest area. The backgrounds were consistent, the same picnic tables, the same brick building, even the same sodium vapor light, though in the earlier photos it appeared newer and brighter. What unsettled me was not the location, but the subjects themselves. Every single person in every single photograph bore the same expression, a look of profound weariness that seemed to go beyond simple travel fatigue. Their eyes, though clearly focused on the camera, seemed to be gazing at something far beyond it, something that filled them with a deep, inexplicable sadness. As my eyes moved from frame to frame, I began to notice other disturbing details. The clothing and hairstyles clearly placed the photographs across different time periods, from what appeared to be the 1950s through to much more recent times. Yet the quality of each image was identical, as if they had all been taken with the same camera under the same conditions. More troubling still was the realization that many of the more recent photographs showed people standing beside vehicles I recognized, truck models and car designs that should have been decades apart, yet appeared in images that seemed to have been taken simultaneously. I was so absorbed in studying these photographs that I almost missed the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the restroom. They were slow, measured steps, accompanied by what sounded like the tap of a walking stick or cane against the tile floor. I called out a greeting, assuming another traveler had arrived seeking shelter from the storm, but received no response except for the continued approach of those deliberate footfalls. Something about the rhythm of the steps filled me with an inexplicable dread, and I found myself reluctant to leave the relative security of the restroom to investigate. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the corridor beyond was empty, illuminated only by the same flickering fluorescent lights that had made the photographs dance and shift on the walls. Yet the sound of footsteps continued, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the building itself had developed a slow, steady heartbeat. I followed the sound toward what appeared to be a small visitor information center, a room I had not noticed during my initial exploration of the facility. The room contained the usual assortment of tourism brochures and local maps, their bright colors faded with age and exposure to the uncertain lighting. But dominating one wall was a large display case that made my breath catch in my throat. Inside, arranged with museum-like precision, were dozens of personal items. Wallets, watches, jewelry, keychains, cell phones, ranging from modern smartphones to models so old they seemed like artifacts from another era. Each item was accompanied by a small placard, and as I read them, I realized they were labeled with dates spanning from the rest area's opening in 1952 to as recently as last month. The most recent entry showed a set of car keys attached to a small stuffed animal, the kind of keychain a child might give their parent. The placard read, Rebecca Martinez, October 15, 2024, and I realized with a chill that today's date was October 23rd. According to the display, Rebecca Martinez had been here just 8 days ago, yet her keys rested behind glass like a memorial to something lost forever. It was then that I noticed the guest book, an enormous leather-bound volume that lay open on a pedestal near the display.